The vault door in row 9C was open again when I arrived that Thursday morning. I'm Arnett, and I've been director of Greenlawn Memorial Gardens for 22 years. I've seen everything from families fighting over burial plots to teenagers breaking in on Halloween. I've handled floods, foundation shifts, and one memorable incident involving a backhoe and a gas line. But I'd never seen a sealed vault work itself open, not until that October. The first time I noticed it was a Tuesday. I was doing my usual morning walkthrough before the staff arrived, checking for vandalism or storm damage. Section 9C sits at the eastern edge of the property, where the old oaks create heavy shade even at noon. When I rounded the corner past the Hendricks Mausoleum, I saw it immediately. The concrete vault door, a heavy thing that takes 2 men and a hydraulic lift to position, was ajar by maybe 6 inches. My first thought was settlement. The ground shifts, foundations crack, seals fail. It happens. But when I knelt down to inspect it, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were trails in the dirt around the opening, not drag marks or scratches, trails, like something had pushed through loose soil to get out. Yet when I stood and examined the grass above the vault, it was undisturbed, thick, healthy, autumn damp grass, with no sign of upheaval. I called our maintenance supervisor, Marcus, and we resealed the vault that afternoon. Used fresh concrete, checked the integrity of the surrounding structure, made sure everything was level and secure. The deceased had been interred 3 months prior, a 78-year-old woman named Claire Dockery, who died of natural causes. Nothing unusual about the burial. Standard service, standard vault, standard everything. The next morning, it was open again. Same gap, same 6 inches, same dirt trails leading away from the opening, and the same untouched grass above. Marcus stood there with his coffee steaming in the cold air, just staring at it. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Must be pressure from below, gas buildup or something." His voice didn't sound convinced. We sealed it again, double-checked everything. I even stayed late that evening, sitting in my truck at the edge of Section 9C until the light failed, watching for animals or pranksters. Nothing moved except the wind in the oak branches. Thursday morning, it was open again. That's when I pulled the security footage. We have cameras covering the main sections, though 9C is at the edge of the range. The angle isn't perfect, but it's good enough to see the vault. I sat in my office with Marcus and our head groundskeeper, scrolling through the previous night's recording. At first, there was nothing, just static darkness and the occasional drift of leaves across the frame. Then, at 3:47 a.m., movement. The vault door shifted. Not quickly, not violently. It moved the way ice shifts on a warming lake, gradual, inexorable, patient. Over the course of 4 minutes, we watched it inch open, concrete scraping against concrete in silence, until it reached that familiar 6-inch gap. Then it stopped. The timestamp read 3:51 a.m. Marcus left to get more coffee. He didn't come back for an hour. I went back through the footage from the previous nights. Tuesday night, 3:47 to 3:51. Wednesday night, the same. Every night for the past week, the vault had been opening itself with mechanical precision, always stopping at the exact same angle. I called a structural engineer. She arrived Friday afternoon with equipment I didn't understand and spent 3 hours examining the vault, the surrounding earth, the concrete integrity. When she finished, she told me the structure was sound. No cracks, no pressure differentials, no gas buildup, no settling. She packed up her equipment with quick, efficient movements and left without meeting my eyes. Friday night, I stayed in the cemetery, parked my truck behind the Hendricks Mausoleum, where I had a clear view of row 9C. I told myself I'd see an animal, or a prankster, or something that made sense. I brought a thermos of coffee and my tablet with the security feed pulled up, so I could watch from 2 angles at once. At 3:47 a.m., the vault door began to move. I watched it through the windshield and on the screen simultaneously. The same slow, patient movement. The same precise angle. But this time, I was close enough to hear it. The scrape of concrete wasn't silent. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone inside was pushing with measured effort. Push, pause, push, pause. The sound carried across the empty cemetery in the dead October air. I got out of the truck. I don't know why. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to drive away, to call someone. But I walked toward row 9C with my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door stopped moving at 3:51, same as always. I stood 10 feet away, my breath forming clouds in the cold, and listened. From inside the vault, I could hear something. Not scratching, not exactly. It was more like shifting weight, like someone repositioning themselves in a cramped space. Then silence. I should have opened it. That's what a rational person would do, right? Check inside, confirm the body is still properly interred, prove to yourself there's a logical explanation. But I couldn't, because as I stood there in the darkness, I noticed something I'd missed before. The dirt trails leading away from the vault didn't just stop at the grass line. If I angled my flashlight just right, I could see faint impressions continuing across the grass, too subtle to notice in daylight, but visible in the harsh beam. They led away from the vault, between the headstones, toward the service road, toward the cemetery exit. I followed them with my light, stepping carefully. The impressions were barely there, just the slightest compression of grass blades, but they were consistent. They led in a straight line for 30 yards, then faded completely at the asphalt. I sealed the vault again Saturday morning, used a different crew, different materials, triple-checked everything. I didn't tell them about the footage, or the sounds, or the trails. I just told them to make it permanent. Sunday morning, it was open again. 3:47 to 3:51 a.m. on the footage. Same as always. I stopped sealing it after that. What's the point? Every morning I do my rounds, and every morning the vault is open exactly 6 inches. The grass above remains undisturbed. The dirt trails are there, leading nowhere and everywhere. I've stopped watching the footage. I already know what I'll see. But sometimes, late at night when I'm locking up, I walk past section 9C and I listen, just for a moment. And sometimes, in the space between 3:47 and 3:51 a.m., I hear that sound again. Shifting weight, patient movement. The sound of someone who's learned to measure their strength, who knows exactly how far they need to push to get where they're going. I don't know where Claire Dockery goes when she leaves her vault. I don't know if she comes back before dawn, or if what returns is still her. I just know that every morning, the door is open. And every night, I make sure I'm gone before 3:47. I've been doing this work for 16 years, and I know what a sealed jaw looks like. My name is Jude, and I'm a licensed embalmer at Riverside Funeral Home. I handle everything from the initial preparation to the final viewing, and I take pride in my work. The deceased deserve dignity, and families deserve peace. That's the philosophy that's guided me since I started this profession. Every detail matters. Every adjustment, every cosmetic touch, every positioning choice. When a family looks at their loved one for the last time, they should see them at rest, at peace, properly cared for. Richard Tenner came to us on a Wednesday morning. 74 years old, died of congestive heart failure in his sleep. His wife, Dorothy, made the arrangements with our director. Standard service, open casket viewing before cremation. She was composed during the planning, the way people sometimes are when they've had time to prepare for the inevitable. She brought his favorite suit, navy blue, slightly worn at the elbows, and a photograph from their 40th anniversary for me to reference. I began the preparation Thursday morning. Everything was routine. The embalming process went smoothly, no complications. His features were relaxed, peaceful. I paid special attention to his jaw positioning, using a needle injector to secure the mandible, then sealing it with adhesive. It's crucial for maintaining the natural appearance. A jaw positioned incorrectly can make the deceased look uncomfortable, even pained. I positioned his at a natural rest, slightly closed, the way a person looks in peaceful sleep. The viewing was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Private. Just immediate family. Dorothy had requested 30 minutes alone with him before the others arrived. I prepared the viewing room that morning, adjusted the lighting, made sure the temperature was appropriate. Richard looked good. Natural color, relaxed features, hands positioned comfortably at his waist. I'd even managed to get his collar to sit properly, which can be tricky. I did my final check at 1 p.m., an hour before the family was due to arrive. Everything was perfect. His jaw was exactly as I'd positioned it, sealed, secure, at rest. At 2 p.m., I opened the viewing room for Dorothy. She was alone, carrying a small clutch purse and wearing a black dress that looked like it had been purchased recently. I gave her the usual gentle guidance, told her to take as much time as she needed, and stepped out to give her privacy. It's what we always do. That final moment alone is sacred. I was in the arrangement office down the hall when I heard her voice. Not a scream, not a cry, just her speaking softly, the way you'd talk to someone who's sleeping. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was tender, intimate. I've heard it before from grieving spouses. Sometimes they just need to say one more thing, to have one more conversation. I let her be. 20 minutes later, I checked through the viewing room's observation window, a small, one-way mirror we keep for security and to gauge if families need support. Dorothy was standing beside the casket, her hand resting on Richard's folded hands, her head bowed. Normal. Appropriate. I was about to step away when something made me look again. Richard's jaw had moved. Not drastically, not obviously, but it wasn't in the position I'd left it. The angle had shifted, tilted slightly to the right, and his lips were parted maybe half an inch, as if he'd been about to speak, and stopped mid-breath. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline. That's not possible. Not with the way I'd secured it. I sealed that jaw myself with professional-grade adhesive and a needle injector. It would take significant force to move it, and even then, it wouldn't shift into a natural position like that. It would tear, distort, look wrong. This looked intentional. I entered the room quietly, not wanting to startle Dorothy. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes but didn't seem upset by my presence. "He looks peaceful," she said softly. "Thank you for that." I nodded, moving around to the other side of the casket, my trained eye scanning Richard's face. The jaw was definitely different. I knew what I'd done that morning. This wasn't my work. "Mrs. Tenner," I said carefully, "has anyone else been in the room with you?" She shook her head. "No, just me." "Why?" "No reason. I just want to make sure everything is as it should be." I looked at Richard's face again. The jaw, the lips, the angle of his head. Everything else was exactly as I'd positioned it. Only the jaw had moved. Dorothy leaned closer to Richard, her hand moving to touch his face with the kind of tenderness that comes from decades of marriage. "He wanted to tell me something," she whispered. "At the end. In the hospital. But he couldn't get the words out. His breathing was too labored." She smiled sadly. "I told him it was okay, that I knew he loved me, but I could see it in his eyes. There was something else, something important." I didn't respond. I was staring at Richard's face, at the slight part in his lips, at the angle that suggested speech. It was subtle, but it was there. The exact positioning you'd see if someone had been interrupted mid-sentence. "I keep thinking about it," Dorothy continued, her voice barely audible. "What he needed to say. If it was about the house, or finances, or—" She trailed off, her fingers resting against his cheek. "I just wish I knew." That's when I saw it. At the corner of Richard's right eye, closest to where Dorothy stood, there was moisture. Not much, just a small amount, barely visible, catching the soft light of the viewing room. I've been doing this work long enough to know what normal moisture looks like on the deceased. This wasn't that. This was fresh, as if it had just appeared. I stepped back instinctively. Dorothy didn't notice, lost in her own thoughts, her hand still resting against Richard's face. The moisture was definitely there. I watched it, my heart hammering, waiting for it to spread or drip or do something that would prove it was just condensation, just a trick of the preparation chemicals, just anything normal. It didn't move. It just sat there, at the corner of his eye, like a tear that had started to fall but never finished. "Mrs. Tenner," I said, my voice more strained than I intended, "I need to step out for a moment. Take your time." She nodded without looking at me, her attention entirely on her husband. I left the room and closed the door behind me, my hands shaking slightly. I stood in the hallway and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Jaw movement could be explained by settling, though not easily with the security measures I'd used. Moisture could be residual fluid, though it shouldn't appear that quickly or in that location. Both things together, at the exact moment when his widow was talking about his final unspoken message, that stretched coincidence into something else entirely. I waited in the hallway, watching through the observation mirror. Dorothy stood there for another 10 minutes, speaking softly to Richard, her hand never leaving his face. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see her expression shift from sadness to something else, something almost like relief. When she finally emerged, she looked calmer than when she'd arrived. "Thank you," she said to me. "He looks so peaceful, like he's just sleeping." She paused at the door, clutching her purse. "You know, I think he heard me. I told him everything was going to be fine." That I understood. She smiled, and it was genuine. "I think he knows now." After she left, I went back into the viewing room alone. Richard's jaw was still in that position, slightly open, angled as if mid-speech. The moisture at his eye had dried, leaving the faintest trace. I stood there for a long time, looking at him, trying to see what I'd seen before. Just a body, just preparation and chemicals and professional care. But I couldn't shake it. The positioning was too precise, too intentional. I've repositioned a lot of jaws since then. Every time I think about Richard Tenner and the thing he couldn't say, I think about Dorothy's relief and the moisture at his eye and the way his lips were parted like interrupted speech. I still don't know what he was trying to tell her. Maybe she does now. Maybe that moment in the viewing room was enough, somehow. But when I'm alone in the preparation room, working on someone new, I sometimes catch myself watching their faces a little too closely, waiting to see if they have something to say. The backhoe hit something solid at 8 feet, and the jolt ran through my entire body. I'm Al, head groundskeeper at Oakmont Cemetery, and I've been digging graves here for 19 years. I know this ground like I know my own backyard. Every section, every plot, every inch of settled earth and clay. I know where the old water pipes run, where the roots from the ancient oak spread, where the ground is soft, and where it's dense with limestone. I've dug hundreds of graves here, maybe thousands. I know what resistance feels like when you hit rock or root or forgotten debris. This wasn't any of those things. I killed the engine and climbed down to look. The bucket had scraped across something smooth and man-made, concrete. I knelt at the edge of the excavation and brushed away loose dirt with my gloved hand. The surface was old, stained with decades of soil contact, but definitely concrete. A vault. That didn't make sense. I was working in Section F, Plot 212, which our records showed as unoccupied. I'd checked twice before I started digging, same as I always do. The burial scheduled for tomorrow was supposed to be the first in this plot. New sale, recent purchase. Empty ground. Except it wasn't empty. I called our cemetery manager, Patricia, and she arrived 20 minutes later with the plot map and records. We stood at the edge of the excavation while she scrolled through her tablet, frowning. "There's nothing here," she said. Section F was opened in 1985. This plot has never been sold or occupied, according to every record we have. There's a vault down there, I said. And it's old. Look at the concrete. She looked. I could see the moment her confusion shifted to concern. We need to open it. It took me 2 hours to carefully excavate around the vault, exposing enough to get a seal break. The concrete was poured in a style we stopped using in the 1970s, cruder, thicker, with visible aggregate. Whatever was down there had been buried for decades. Patricia called our director, called the county, called everyone she could think of while I worked. By the time I had it exposed, a small crowd had gathered. Patricia, our director, and a county records clerk who'd driven over with a box of archived burial logs. They stood at the edge of the excavation, speaking in low voices while I attached chains to the vault lid. The seal broke with a grinding crack that echoed across the cemetery. I used the backhoe's hydraulics to lift the lid slowly, carefully. When it cleared the vault edge, I swung it aside and climbed down into the excavation. The smell hit me first, not decomposition. Time had handled that decades ago. Just old air, earth, and something else. Something like metal and old fabric. I clicked on my flashlight and directed the beam into the vault. A casket. Small, child-sized. My stomach dropped before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. It was white, or had been. Age had yellowed it, and moisture had left rust trails from the hardware. The style was from the 1960s, maybe earlier. Ornate handles, decorative corners, the kind of children's casket that tried too hard to be dignified and just ended up looking sad. There's a casket, I called up. Child-sized, old. Patricia's face appeared at the edge of the excavation, looking down at me. Can you see a nameplate? I moved closer, my boots squelching in the damp earth at the bottom of the vault. The casket's nameplate was tarnished, covered in a film of dirt and oxidation. I pulled off my glove and used my thumb to wipe it clean, revealing engraved letters beneath. The world tilted. Emma Louise Garrett. My daughter's name. Her full name. The name my wife and I gave her when she was born 7 years ago. The name she writes in careful block letters on her school papers. The name I call up the stairs every morning to wake her for breakfast. My hand stayed frozen on the nameplate. I couldn't move. I couldn't process what I was seeing. It had to be a coincidence. Emma isn't an uncommon name. Louise is traditional. Garrett is our last name. But it's not unique. It was just coincidence. Except the engraving below the name had dates. Born March 15th, 1958. Died November 2nd, 1963. My Emma was born March 15th, 2018. Same day, same month, 60 years apart. Al? Patricia's voice sounded distant. What does it say? I couldn't answer. I was staring at those dates, at that name, my mind racing through impossible explanations. This casket had been here since the 1960s. My daughter was asleep at home. This was someone else's child. Someone else's Emma Louise Garrett, buried in the wrong place or lost in forgotten records. It had to be. I made myself look at the rest of the nameplate. Below the dates, another line of engraving. Beloved daughter of Albert and Caroline Garrett. Albert is my name. My wife's name is Caroline. I stumbled backward, my boot catching on the casket's corner bracket. I went down hard, my shoulder hitting the concrete vault wall. The flashlight fell from my hand and rolled across the casket lid, its beam creating wild shadows. Al. Patricia was climbing down into the excavation, her shoes sliding in the dirt. Al. What's wrong? I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the nameplate with a shaking hand. She looked. I watched her face as she read the name, saw her confusion, then her glance up at me with something like concern. Is this a relative? That's my daughter's name, I managed to say. Exact name. Her birthday. Our names. Patricia stared at the engraving, then back at me. That's not possible. This has been here for decades. It's just a coincidence, Al. An unsettling one, but read the dates, I said. Read her birthday. She did. I saw her face change. March 15th. When's your daughter's birthday? March 15th. The silence that followed was heavy. Above us, the director called down asking if everything was all right. Patricia told him we needed a minute. She knelt beside the casket, examining the nameplate more closely. This could be a family name, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe someone in your family tree? Same tradition of names? I shook my head. I'd grown up in California, moved to this state when I was 25. No family connections here. No family history of Emmas or Louises. And even if there were, what were the odds? Same full name, same birthday, same parents' names, buried in a plot I was randomly assigned to dig? I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and called Caroline. It rang 4 times before she answered, her voice cheerful and routine. Hey, what's up? Is Emma there? I asked. Is she okay? A pause. She's fine. She's watching cartoons. Why? Can you put her on the phone? Al, what's wrong? You sound... Please. Another pause. Then my daughter's voice, bright and unconcerned. Hi, Daddy. I closed my eyes, relief flooding through me. Hey, Bug, what are you watching? She told me about her cartoon. Some story about talking animals that I couldn't focus on. I just listened to her voice, alive and present and real. When she handed the phone back to Caroline, I told my wife I'd explain later and hung up. Patricia was still examining the casket. Al, this doesn't mean anything. It's bizarre, absolutely. But it's not. It can't be anything other than coincidence. I climbed out of the excavation without responding. The county clerk was looking through his archived logs, shaking his head. I can't find any record of a burial in Section F before 1985, he said. Nothing even close. If this vault is from the 60s, it shouldn't be here. It's not in any plot, plan, any map, any log. The director made calls. We excavated more carefully, documented everything, took photographs. By evening, they decided to exhume the casket and move it to proper storage until the family could be located and notified. If there was a family, if those names were real, and not just some impossible echo. I volunteered to help with the exhumation. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see it through. Maybe I needed to prove to myself it was real, and not some stress-induced hallucination. We lifted the casket out carefully, placed it on a transport gurney. It was light, too light, either empty or containing only the smallest remains. Before they took it away, I looked at the nameplate one more time in the fading daylight. Emma Louise Garrett. March 15th, 1958. Beloved daughter of Albert and Caroline Garrett. I went home that night and watched my daughter sleep. 7 years old, breathing softly, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. Real, present, alive. I stayed there until Caroline found me and led me to bed, asking questions I couldn't answer. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 5 years. I couldn't go back to that section. I couldn't look at that excavation where we'd found something impossible. Patricia texted me updates throughout the day. The casket was in storage. The county was searching for records. No one could explain how it got there or why it wasn't documented. They never did find an explanation. The casket remains in county storage, unclaimed. The plot was eventually filled with the burial we'd scheduled, after I had someone else finish the excavation. I've never been back to Section F, Plot 212, but sometimes, late at night, I wake up and walk to my daughter's room. I watch her sleep, and I think about that other Emma Louise Garrett, the one who died in 1963. I think about her parents, Albert and Caroline, who lost their daughter and buried her in ground that wouldn't remember her. I think about how the earth keeps secrets we were never meant to find. And I wonder if somewhere, in some record or photograph or forgotten memory, there's a groundskeeper from 1963 who shares my face and looks at his daughter with the same fear I now carry. The fear that the ground knows something about our children that we don't. The flowers were there again when I opened the gates at dawn. I'm Nina, head caretaker at Riverside Memorial Cemetery, and I've been maintaining these grounds for 14 years. I know every grave, every tree, every patch of crabgrass that needs attention. I know who brings flowers and when, who visits on anniversaries, who comes at Christmas with wreaths. After this many years, you learn the rhythms of grief. You learn to see patterns. But this pattern made no sense. It started in late September, right after the first cold snap. I was doing my morning rounds, checking for wind damage after a storm the night before, when I saw them. Fresh white lilies on grave B47, arranged in a perfect circle around the headstone, not scattered or casual like most flower placement. A deliberate circle, each stem equidistant from the next, heads all facing inward toward the stone. Martha Hensley, born 1927, died August 2024. She'd been buried just 6 weeks earlier, and according to our records, she had no living relatives. Died alone in a nursing home, funeral paid for by the state. 7 people attended her service, all staff from the home. No family, no friends from earlier in her life. Just the quiet ending that comes to people who outlive everyone they knew. So who was bringing flowers? I checked the cemetery log. No deliveries scheduled. No visitors signed in after hours. Not that anyone could sign in after hours. I locked the gates myself at dusk, and I'm the only one with a key besides the owner. The fence is 8 feet of wrought iron with decorative spikes on top. People don't just wander in and out. I assumed someone had been by during open hours the day before. Someone I'd missed. Maybe a distant relative we didn't know about. Or a nurse from the home who'd grown attached. It happens. I made a note to keep an eye out, to catch them next time so I could update our records. The next morning, there were fresh flowers again. Same arrangement. Same perfect circle. Same white lilies. But these were new. I could tell by the stems, by the moisture still beading on the petals. These had been cut and placed within hours, not the day before. And I'd locked the gates at 6 p.m., checked them twice before driving home. I'd even walked the fence line looking for storm damage. No one had been there. I knelt beside the grave, examining the flowers more closely. The variety was unusual. They looked like Lilium candidum, Madonna lilies, but the petals were too white, too perfect, almost luminescent in the early morning light. I'm not an expert, but I've seen enough funeral flowers to know common varieties. These were different. The grass around the grave was heavy with dew, undisturbed except for my own footprints approaching from the path. If someone had placed these flowers, they'd left no trace, no footprints, no impressions in the soft earth around the headstone. The circle of lilies sat there like it had appeared from nowhere. I took photographs, called our owner Mr. Reeves, and sent them to him. He told me to check the security cameras. We have 3 cameras covering the main sections. B section is just barely in range of camera 2. I pulled up the footage from the previous night, starting at 6 p.m. when I'd locked up. I watched the timestamp roll forward through sunset, through twilight, into full darkness. Nothing moved except wind-stirred branches casting shadows across the graves. Then, at 11:47 p.m., the camera glitched. Just for a second. A brief flicker of static, and when the image returned, the flowers were there. I rewound and watched again. One frame showed bare grass around Martha Hensley's headstone. Static. Next frame showed the complete circle of lilies, perfectly arranged. I went back further, checking the previous night's footage. Same thing. 11:47 p.m. A moment of static, and the flowers appeared. Mr. Reeves suggested wildlife, vandals, some kind of prank, but that didn't explain the camera glitch, or the lack of footprints, or how someone was getting flowers into a locked cemetery. He told me to stake it out, to stay after closing, and watch the grave in person. So I did. That evening, I locked the gates as usual, but instead of leaving, I parked my truck behind the maintenance shed with a clear view of B section. I brought coffee and a blanket. October nights get cold. I told myself I'd catch whoever was doing this, get some answers, maybe call the police if it was trespassing. The sun set. Darkness came. The cemetery transformed the way it does after hours, familiar spaces becoming strange. Headstones casting long shadows, the wind making sounds that seemed almost like voices. I'd been here at night before, but never like this. Never watching, never waiting. My watch read 11:45. I trained my flashlight on grave B47, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing moved. No one approached. The grave sat quiet and still in the pool of light. 11:46. The temperature dropped. I felt it suddenly. A cold that came from nowhere and pressed against my skin through my jacket. My breath started fogging, which it hadn't been doing a moment before. The flashlight beam seemed dimmer, struggling against the darkness. 11:47. The flowers appeared. I don't know how else to describe it. They weren't placed. They didn't grow. They simply manifested, stem by stem, forming that perfect circle around Martha Hensley's headstone. White lilies materializing from nothing, their petals catching my flashlight beam and glowing with that strange luminescence. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I sat in my truck with the flashlight shaking in my hand and watched flowers appear from empty air. When the circle was complete, maybe 10 seconds after it began, the temperature returned to normal. The oppressive cold lifted. My flashlight brightened, and the flowers sat there like they'd been there all day, perfect and impossible. I didn't go check them that night. I started my truck and drove home with my hands gripping the wheel so hard my fingers ached. The next morning, I called in sick. I've never called in sick, not in 14 years, but I couldn't go back. Couldn't face that grave and those flowers and the reality of what I'd seen. Mr. Reeves called me that afternoon. He'd gone to check on things himself and found the flowers. He wanted to know if I'd seen anything unusual. I told him no. I don't know why. Maybe because saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready to accept. I came back to work 3 days later. The flowers were still there, exactly as they'd been. Perfect circle, pristine white petals, no sign of wilting. I checked every morning after that. Fresh flowers, always at 11:47 p.m. according to the camera glitches, always in that same arrangement. I started researching Martha Hensley, called the nursing home, talked to the staff who'd attended her funeral. They all said the same thing. She was quiet, kept to herself, never had visitors. One nurse mentioned that Martha used to talk about flowers, about a garden she'd tended in her youth, white lilies specifically. She said they'd grown all around her childhood home, that her mother had loved them. I looked up white lilies native to our region, found articles about varieties that had been common here decades ago but had mostly disappeared. Lilium candidum had grown wild in this area until the 1960s, when development and pollution killed them off. They'd been gone from our ecosystem for more than 30 years. The flowers on Martha Hensley's grave were Lilium candidum. I was sure of it now. Flowers that no longer grew here, appearing from nowhere every night, arranged in a circle that no living hand created. I started leaving the grave alone, stopped photographing it, stopped checking the cameras. Some of the other staff noticed, asked me why I was avoiding B section. I made excuses. Too much work in other areas, prioritizing the newer sections. Anything to avoid explaining. But one morning in late October, I found something different. The flowers were there, same as always, but lying in the center of the circle, resting against the base of Martha Hensley's headstone, was a photograph. Old, faded, the edges worn. It showed a young woman standing in a garden filled with white lilies, smiling at the camera. She looked happy, loved. I turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink. Martha, summer 1949. My beautiful girl. I put the photograph back where I found it. I didn't tell anyone about it. What would I say? That a dead woman with no relatives, no visitors, no one who remembered her name, was receiving flowers from someone who'd been gone for decades? That her mother, or whoever had written that note, was still tending her garden after death? The flowers still appear every morning. I've stopped questioning it. I just maintain the rest of the cemetery and leave B47 alone. Let Martha Hensley have her flowers. Let her have that one connection to whoever loved her enough to cross whatever boundary exists between life and death, just to bring her white lilies. Some nights, when I lock the gates at dusk, I look toward B section and think about staying, about watching the flowers appear again, about trying to understand what I'm seeing. But I never do, because I think some acts of love aren't meant to be understood. They're just meant to continue. I saw them in my rearview mirror at 12:37 a.m. on Route 9. My name is Ellis, and I've been driving transport for mortuaries and funeral homes for 11 years. I handle transfers between facilities, late-night pickups from hospitals, long-distance moves when families want their loved ones buried somewhere far from where they died. It's solitary work mostly. Just me, the hearse, and empty roads at hours when most people are sleeping. I prefer it that way. Quiet, simple, no traffic, no complications. The call came at 11 p.m. County Hospital needed a transfer to Fairview Funeral Home, about 40 miles south. Standard job. I'd done this route dozens of times. The deceased was an elderly man named Robert Fisk, 89 years old, died of pneumonia. No family present. The hospital staff had him ready when I arrived, body bagged, paperwork signed, everything efficient and professional. I loaded him into the hearse myself. It's a newer model, well-maintained, with good heating and a smooth ride. I always try to give the deceased a dignified final journey, even if no one's there to see it. It matters to me. The drive started normally. Empty roads, clear night, temperature just above freezing. I took Route 9 like I always do, a straight shot through rural farmland with minimal turns. The highway was mine. No other vehicles, no houses with lit windows, just my headlights cutting through the darkness. At 12:37 a.m., I checked my rearview mirror out of habit. There were people behind the hearse, walking, dozens of them, maybe more, all dressed formally dark suits, black dresses, clothing that looked old-fashioned in a way I couldn't quite place. They walked in a loose procession, filling the road from shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale in the red glow of my taillights. I hit the brakes instinctively, my heart jumping. The hearse slowed to a stop in the middle of Route 9. I stared at the rearview mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The procession continued walking. They didn't react to me stopping, didn't slow down or speed up, just maintained that steady, measured pace. Getting closer with each step, they were silent, completely silent. No footsteps, no conversation, no sound at all. Despite dozens of people walking on asphalt, I grabbed my phone to call. Who? The police? What would I tell them? There are people following my hearse at midnight? That's not illegal. That's not even necessarily strange. Maybe there was an event nearby, a memorial service that ran late, something that explained why this many people in formal clothing were on Route 9 in the middle of the night. But it felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. I looked at the mirror again. They were closer now, close enough that I could see details. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes fixed on the hearse. Their clothing wasn't just old-fashioned, it was vintage. Styles from different eras mixed together. A woman in a 1920s dress, walking beside a man in a modern suit. A child in clothing from the 50s, holding the hand of someone in formal wear from the 80s. They were 30 feet behind me now, 20 feet. I put the hearse in drive and accelerated gently, not wanting to be disrespectful if these were somehow real mourners, but needing distance. The speedometer climbed to 40, then 50. I watched the mirror. They kept pace, not running, still walking with that same measured step, but somehow maintaining the exact distance behind me As if the laws of physics didn't apply to them, their expressions never changed. Their mouths never moved. They just walked, silent and purposeful, following me down Route 9. I pushed the speed to 60. The hearse handled it well. The road was straight and empty. But in the mirror, the procession remained perfectly in view, unchanged by my speed, still 20 feet behind, as if I hadn't moved at all. My hands were shaking on the wheel. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. I was tired, or sick, or suffering from some kind of carbon monoxide leak. There had to be a rational explanation. I looked away from the mirror, focused on the road ahead, tried to calm my breathing, counted to 10, told myself that when I looked back, they'd be gone. Just a trick of exhaustion and bad light, and an overactive imagination. At 15 miles per hour, I checked the mirror again. They were closer. 10 feet now. Close enough that I could see their faces clearly. Men, women, children. Different ages, different eras, all watching the hearse with that same fixed, empty expression. The woman in the 20s dress was in front now. I could see her eyes in the rear view, and they were looking directly at me. I slammed on the brakes and threw the hearse into park. This needed to end. I needed to confront whatever this was, prove to myself it was real, or prove it wasn't. But I couldn't keep driving with them following me. I got out of the hearse. The road behind me was empty. No people, no procession, just dark asphalt stretching back under a sky full of stars. The only sound was wind rustling through bare corn stalks in the fields on either side of the road. I stood there for a long moment, my breath fogging in the cold air, looking at nothing. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? 11 years of driving transport without incident, and suddenly I'm seeing phantom funeral processions? I walked to the back of the hearse, checked the rear door, still secured, walked around the vehicle, checking the tires, the paint, anything that might show evidence of what was I even looking for? That's when I noticed the rear window. The glass was fogged from the inside. Not unusual temperature differentials can cause that, but the pattern of the fog wasn't random. There were impressions in it, dozens of them. Small circles of clear glass surrounded by condensation, as if someone had been pressing their faces against the window from inside the hearse, their breath fogging the glass around them. Faces. So many faces. I backed away from the vehicle, my heart hammering. The rear window was completely fogged, except for those clear spots, perfect circles where breath had been, where faces had been pressed against glass, leaving their mark. But that was impossible. The fog was on the inside. No one was in the back of the hearse except Robert Fisk's body, and the dead don't breathe. I got back in the driver's seat, didn't look at the rear window again. Just started the engine and drove the remaining 20 miles to Fairview Funeral Home with my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to check the rearview mirror. When I arrived, I unloaded Robert Fisk in silence. The funeral home's night attendant signed the paperwork without much conversation. I didn't mention what I'd seen. What would I say? That the dead man I was transporting had mourners following him? That they'd somehow fogged the rear window from inside a locked vehicle? I did check that rear window before I left, though. The fog was gone. The glass was clear and clean, showing nothing but my own reflection. I've done 6 more transports since that night, 3 of them along Route 9. Each time I tell myself it was exhaustion, or stress, or some weird atmospheric phenomenon that caused what I saw. But I don't check my rearview mirror as often anymore. And I've started taking different routes when I can, even if they're longer. Because 2 weeks after the Robert Fisk transport, I did a pickup at the same county hospital. Different deceased, different destination. An elderly woman this time died peacefully, surrounded by family. They'd had a proper goodbye, filled out all the paperwork in advance, done everything right. I loaded her at 10 p.m. and started the drive. Took Route 7 this time, deliberately avoiding Route 9. At 11:23 p.m., I checked my rearview mirror. They were there again. The procession, formally dressed, silent, walking with that measured pace. But this time, there were fewer of them, maybe a dozen instead of dozens. And they looked different, older clothing styles, turn-of-the-century formal wear, as if they'd been waiting longer. I didn't stop that time, just kept driving, watching them in the mirror, waiting for them to disappear or for me to prove they weren't real. They followed me for 7 miles before fading, becoming translucent, and finally disappearing as I approached the city limits. The rear window was fogged when I arrived. Same pattern, same breath marks pressed against glass from the inside. I think I understand now, though I don't like what I understand. Some people die without proper goodbyes, without mourners, or ceremony, or anyone to witness their passing. They leave the world quietly, alone, unacknowledged, but someone acknowledges them. Something acknowledges them, and when I transport their bodies through the night, along empty roads where the living don't go, those witnesses follow. They bear witness to the journey, to the final transfer from death to rest, because no one else will. I still drive transport. I still take late-night calls, but I've learned not to look at my rearview mirror unless necessary. And I've learned to expect the fogged rear window, the breath marks on glass, the evidence of witnesses I'll never see clearly. Some funerals happen on dark roads at midnight, attended by mourners who don't need invitation or names. They just follow, and they never make a sound. The temperature alarm for cold room 3 went off at 4 a.m., and I knew it was him again. I'm Reeves, Chief Mortician at County Medical Examiner's Office, and I've been working with the dead for 23 years. I've handled everything from natural deaths to homicides, from bodies in perfect condition to remains that barely qualify as identifiable. I've seen decomposition at every stage, dealt with families in every state of grief, and maintained professional composure through situations that would break most people. But I'd never dealt with a body that refused to stay cold. His name was Vincent Castellano, 76 years old, found dead in his apartment from what appeared to be natural causes. No signs of foul play, no suspicious circumstances. His daughter reported him missing when he didn't answer calls for 3 days. Police found him in his recliner, television still on, apparently dead for about 48 hours before discovery. The autopsy was routine. Heart failure, consistent with his medical history. I processed him myself, photographed, documented, sampled, everything by the book. When I finished, I wheeled him to cold room 3, the newest of our refrigeration units, and placed him in drawer 7. That was a Thursday evening. Friday morning, the temperature alarm was screaming. I checked the readout on cold room 3's external display. Drawer 7, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Every other drawer in the unit showed the correct temperature, 38 degrees. Just drawer 7 was malfunctioning. I opened it, expecting equipment failure or a broken seal. Vincent Castellano lay exactly as I'd positioned him. Body bag sealed, identification tag attached. But when I touched the bag, I could feel warmth through the material. Not refrigerated cold, body temperature, human warmth. I checked the drawer's cooling element. No visible damage. The system was running. I closed the drawer, made a note for maintenance, and moved Vincent Castellano to cold room 1 while they serviced the unit. Saturday morning, cold room 1's alarm went off. Same drawer, same temperature, 98.6 degrees. Vincent Castellano's body bag was warm to the touch. The maintenance tech came that morning. Spent 3 hours checking the refrigeration systems, the seals, the temperature sensors. Found nothing wrong. Both units were functioning perfectly. Every drawer maintained correct temperature when tested empty. The problem only occurred when Vincent Castellano was inside. Must be something about the body, the tech said, packing up his tools. Decomposition gases can generate heat. Might be reacting weird with the cooling system. But I'd been doing this work for 23 years. I knew what decomposition heat felt like, what gases did to a body. This wasn't that. This was different. This was precise. Always exactly 98.6 degrees. Living body temperature. I moved Vincent Castellano to cold room 2. Made sure the drawer was functioning perfectly before I placed him inside. Checked it twice before I left that evening. Sunday morning, the alarm. Same temperature, same warmth. Cold room 2's other drawers were fine. Just drawer 12, where I'd placed Vincent Castellano, had spiked to 98.6 degrees. I stood in the cold hallway outside the refrigeration units, listening to the alarm, and felt something I hadn't felt in years of working with the dead. Unease. Deep, instinctive unease. I called my supervisor, Dr. Morrison, explained the situation. He suggested I re-examine the body, check for any anomalies I might have missed, any biological explanation for the temperature spikes. So I wheeled Vincent Castellano to the examination room and unsealed the body bag. He looked exactly as he should. No signs of advanced decomposition, no gas buildup, no physical explanation for what was happening. I photographed him again, took additional samples, rechecked every note from the original autopsy. Nothing. Completely normal deceased male. Heart failure. No complications. But when I positioned him back in the body bag, I noticed something. His right hand had shifted slightly. Not much, just enough that the fingers were no longer flat against his side. They were curved, as if grasping something. I repositioned the hand flat, the way it should be, made sure everything was correct, sealed the bag, and returned him to cold room 2. Monday morning, I came in early, 4:30 a.m., half an hour before the day shift. I wanted to check the temperature before the alarm had a chance to go off, to see if I could catch the malfunction happening in real time. Cold room 2's external display showed drawer 12 at 98.6 degrees. I opened the drawer immediately. The body bag was warm, and when I looked at Vincent Castellano through the clear panel in the bag, his hand had moved again. Not slightly this time. His right arm was raised, bent at the elbow, hand extended above his chest. One finger pointed upward at an angle. I could see it clearly through the bag's plastic, an impossible position for a body I'd carefully laid flat less than 12 hours earlier. My hands were shaking when I unsealed the bag. The body was warm, not decay warm, living warm. I touched his arm, felt skin temperature that shouldn't exist on a corpse 3 days old. The pointing finger was rigid, fixed in position. I tried to move it gently, to reposition it flat, but there was resistance, not rigor mortis. I knew rigor, and this wasn't it. This was different, deliberate. I followed the line of the pointing finger with my eyes. It wasn't pointing at the ceiling. It was angled, directed at something specific. I stepped back to get the right perspective. He was pointing at the examination room's security camera. The camera was mounted in the corner. Standard installation, always recording. Vincent Castellano's finger aimed directly at its lens with precise accuracy. I stared at that pointing finger for a long time, my professional composure cracking. This wasn't equipment failure. This wasn't decomposition. This was something else entirely. I took photographs, documented everything. Then I did something I'd never done in 23 years of working with the dead. I closed the body bag without repositioning the hand, left it exactly as it was, wheeled Vincent Castellano back to cold room 2 and locked the drawer. Then I went to security and pulled the overnight footage from the examination room. The recording showed me leaving at 5 p.m. Sunday evening, Vincent Castellano sealed and properly positioned in the body bag on the examination table. For hours, nothing changed. The room was still, empty, just the body bag under fluorescent lights. At 2:17 a.m., the body bag shifted. Not a lot, just a small movement, like something inside had repositioned. The bag's surface rippled slightly, then went still. At 2:31 a.m., it shifted again. This time, I could see the outline of a hand pressing against the plastic from inside, fingers extending. The bag's surface stretched as the hand rose, as the arm bent at an impossible angle for a dead man. The finger pointed directly at the camera. the same position I'd found it in. The body bag went still after that. No more movement. Just Vincent Castellano, with his hand raised and pointing, frozen in that position until I'd opened the drawer at 4:30. I watched the footage 3 times, sent it to Dr. Morrison without explanation. He called me 20 minutes later, his voice tight. "What am I looking at?" "Vincent Castellano," I said. "Drawer 12. Cold room 2. "That's not possible." "I know." Silence on the line. Then, "Have you contacted his family?" I had. His daughter Maria was scheduled to come identify the body later that week. Standard procedure. But I hadn't mentioned any of this to her. What would I say? Dr. Morrison told me to keep Vincent Castellano under observation. Document everything. Continue normal procedures. And absolutely do not tell the family about the temperature anomalies or the security footage. So I didn't. I just maintained my routine, checked the cold rooms every morning, and watched Vincent Castellano's drawer temperature spike to 98.6 degrees with perfect consistency. On Wednesday, Maria Castellano came to identify her father's body. I brought her to the viewing room, showed her the standard viewing window. She looked at him through the glass, nodded confirmation, started to cry quietly. "He looks peaceful," she said. I agreed, because it was true. Despite everything, Vincent Castellano looked peaceful, dignified, at rest. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said, wiping her eyes. "Did you find anything unusual when you examined him? Anything strange?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" My father kept telling me something was wrong with him. The last few months before he died, he said he felt like he was being watched, like something was following him, watching what he did. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. He kept saying he needed to show someone, that there was something important people needed to see. I thought about the pointing finger, the camera, the precise angle of accusation. "Did he say what he wanted to show?" I asked carefully. She shook her head. "He wasn't always lucid toward the end. I thought it was just confusion. But he was so insistent, kept pointing at things, trying to make me look." After she left, I went back to the security footage, watched Vincent Castellano's finger point at the camera again, thought about what Maria had said, about her father needing to show people something. I pulled his case file, read through everything again. The police report from when they found him, the initial scene assessment, the photographs. One detail caught my attention. Vincent Castellano had been found in his recliner, television on. The police report mentioned the channel a local news broadcast, and mentioned something else. There was a laptop open on the table beside him. Screen dark, battery dead. I called the detective who'd handled the scene, asked if they'd checked the laptop. He said no, it was a natural death. No investigation needed. The laptop was still in evidence storage, with Vincent Castellano's other personal effects. It took 2 days to get authorization to examine it. When I finally powered it up, I found the last file he'd been viewing. A document. Pages and pages of text. Names, dates, places. A detailed account of financial fraud at the nursing home where he'd worked as an accountant 20 years earlier. Money stolen from residents. Forged documents. Deaths that might not have been natural. And photographs. Evidence Vincent Castellano had apparently collected for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. The document was addressed to the State Attorney General. Unsent. Incomplete. He died before he could finish it. Before he could show anyone what he'd found. I don't know what to do with this information. It's not my job to investigate fraud. I'm a mortician. I handle the dead, not their secrets. But I think about Vincent Castellano, pointing at that camera, insisting on being seen, on being noticed, even after death. His daughter collected his body yesterday for cremation. The temperature alarms stopped after that. Cold room 2 functions normally now. But I made copies of everything I found on his laptop, sent them to the Attorney General myself anonymously. Maybe nothing will come of it. Maybe it's too late, too old, too difficult to prosecute. But Vincent Castellano's finger was pointing, showing me what to look for, refusing to stay cold and forgotten until someone paid attention. I think some people don't rest until they've finished what they started, even if it takes warmth in a cold room and a pointing finger to make the living understand. I heard it during Thomas Merrick's funeral service, and at first I thought it was feedback. My name is Yuki, and I work as a chapel assistant at Riverside Funeral Home. Part of my job is recording services for families who want them relatives who couldn't attend, distant family who want to remember the ceremony, or sometimes just as a keepsake for the immediate family. I've been doing this for 8 years. I know how to position microphones, how to capture voices clearly without picking up unwanted noise, how to edit out coughs and shuffling feet to make a respectful final recording. I've recorded hundreds of services. I know what they should sound like. Thomas Merrick's service started at 2 p.m. on a Thursday. Standard format gathering, music, eulogy, final viewing. About 40 people attended. He'd been a high school teacher for 30 years, retired for 5, died of a stroke at 71. Well-liked, deeply missed, the kind of funeral that felt genuinely sad rather than just obligatory. I set up 3 microphones like I always do. One near the pastor's podium, one mid-chapel to capture ambient sound and music, one near the casket for the final words spoken during viewing. Digital recorders, professional equipment, nothing that should malfunction. Pastor Williams began the eulogy at 2:15. He spoke about Thomas's dedication to teaching, his love for literature, the generations of students he'd influenced. Standard themes, delivered well. I monitored the recording from my position in the back corner, watching the levels, making sure everything was clear. That's when I heard the second voice, quiet, barely audible beneath Pastor Williams's words, whispering the eulogy half a second behind him, like an echo that didn't quite sync. I could hear it through my headphones, a soft voice repeating everything the pastor said, the words slightly delayed, the tone different. Not Pastor Williams's voice, someone else. I looked around the chapel. Everyone was facing forward, listening attentively. No one was whispering. No one was on their phone reading along. The voice I was hearing wasn't coming from the attendees. I checked my equipment. No interference showing on the levels. No feedback loops. The recording was clean, except for that whisper. That impossible echo speaking words it shouldn't know yet, because they were being said for the first time. Thomas believed in the power of words, Pastor Williams said. And beneath his voice, half a second later, Thomas believed in the power of words. The whisper was coming from the casket side microphone. I stared at the audio meters, watching the levels spike on that specific channel. The microphone near Thomas Merrick's closed casket was picking up voice, clear enough to register on my equipment, quiet enough that no one in the chapel seemed to notice. No one was standing near the casket. The closest person was 15 feet away. I considered stopping the recording, checking the equipment, but I couldn't disrupt the service. So I kept monitoring, listening to that whisper repeat every line of the eulogy with eerie precision. Sometimes the words overlapped. Sometimes they were perfectly timed, but always present, always there beneath Pastor Williams's voice like a shadow of sound. The eulogy lasted 12 minutes. For 12 minutes, I listened to 2 voices speaking the same words. When Pastor Williams finished and stepped back from the podium, the whisper stopped. After the service, during the final viewing, I checked the casket side microphone. No problems. Properly positioned, secure, functioning exactly as it should. I packed up my equipment in silence, avoiding eye contact with the family, needing to get back to my office where I could review the recording in private. I transferred the files to my computer and opened the audio editing software, put on my headphones, started from the beginning. The gathering music was clean. The opening words were clear. Then Pastor Williams began the eulogy, and there it was, the second voice, captured perfectly, undeniable. A whisper repeating every word half a second after it was spoken. I isolated the casket side microphone track. Listened to it alone without the other audio. The whisper was louder now, clearer. I could hear the texture of it, breathy, urgent, careful. It sounded like someone speaking with limited air, like someone trying very hard to be heard despite limitations. It sounded like someone reading along, following the eulogy word by word, determined to speak it even if no one would listen. I ran the audio through analysis software, checking the frequency patterns. The whisper registered in ranges human voices use. Not static, not interference, not equipment malfunction. A voice. An actual human voice captured on digital recording equipment, positioned beside a closed casket. I called my supervisor, Lisa, told her I needed her to listen to something without explanation. Sent her the isolated track. She called me back 20 minutes later. What am I listening to? The casket side mic from the Merrick service, I said. Silence. Then, that's not possible. I know. Could it be bleed through from another track? Someone in the chapel standing close? I pulled up the full recording, showed her the video I'd taken from the back of the chapel. No one near the casket during the eulogy. No explanation for the voice. Lisa came to my office. We sat together, listening to Thomas Merrick's whisper repeat Pastor Williams's words. She looked pale. We can't give this to the family, she said finally. I know. Edit it out. Clean it up. Give them a normal recording. So that's what I did. Spent 4 hours carefully removing the whisper from every track, smoothing the audio, making it sound like the service I'd intended to record. The family received a perfect digital memorial. No anomalies. No impossible voices speaking from closed caskets. But I kept the original file. I don't know why. Maybe as evidence. Maybe as proof that I hadn't imagined it. I didn't think about it much after that. Tried to convince myself it was just a weird technical glitch. Something explainable that I simply didn't understand. I recorded 8 more services over the next month without incident. Everything was normal. Until Margaret Chen's funeral. Same setup. Same equipment. Same procedure. The eulogy began at 3 p.m. Her son spoke first, sharing memories. And beneath his voice, I heard it again. The whisper. Repeating his words half a second later, I checked the microphone positions. The casket side mic was active, picking up voice from a closed casket. Margaret Chen, dead 3 days, whispering her son's eulogy as he spoke it. My hands shook as I monitored the recording. No one else could hear it. The attendees sat quietly, listening, grieving. Only I could hear the second voice, the echo that shouldn't exist. After the service, I went straight to the recording and isolated the casket side track. Same phenomenon. Clear whisper, following the spoken words with that half-second delay. I called Lisa again. It happened again. What happened? The voice. Different person, same thing. The deceased is whispering during the eulogy. She didn't respond immediately. Then, Yuki, maybe you should take some time off. This job can be stressful and sometimes... Listen to the file, I said. Please, just listen. She did. And again, she heard what I heard. An impossible voice speaking impossible words. We didn't tell anyone else. We just edited the recording, removed the whisper, delivered a clean file to the family. But now, I was afraid. Afraid to record another service. Afraid of what I'd hear. The 3rd time it happened was at David Rodriguez's funeral. The 4th was at Sarah Kim's. The 5th was at elderly Father Patrick's memorial mass. Each time, the same phenomenon. A whisper beneath the eulogy, following the words, captured on the casket side microphone. Each time, only I seemed to hear it during the service. Each time, the recording confirmed what I'd heard. 5 voices. 5 deceased individuals whispering their own eulogies. I started researching, looking for similar experiences, technical explanations, anything that made sense. I found nothing. No documented cases of deceased individuals creating audio patterns. No scientific explanation for voices captured where no living person stood. But I found something else. A pattern in the audio files. The whispers weren't quite identical to the spoken eulogies. There were tiny differences, words stressed differently, phrases where the emotion changed. As if the deceased were correcting the eulogy, offering their own emphasis, showing what parts mattered most to them. In Thomas Merrick's whisper, he'd emphasized believed in words, with slightly more force than Pastor Williams had. In Margaret Chen's recording, she'd stressed loved her children in a way her son hadn't. They weren't just repeating, they were participating, speaking their own eulogies the way they wanted them spoken. I stopped editing out the whispers after the 6th funeral, started keeping complete original files, listening to them late at night, headphones on, trying to understand what I was documenting. The deceased speak at their own funerals, not to everyone, not out loud, but they're there, following along, whispering the words they once said, correcting the narrative, making sure someone hears them. I'm the one who hears them. I don't know why. Maybe it's the equipment, positioned close enough to catch sounds the living miss. Maybe it's something about me, some sensitivity I didn't know I had. Maybe everyone whispers at their own funeral, and I'm just the first person who's ever recorded it. I still do my job, still record services, still monitor the audio levels and check the equipment. But now I listen more carefully during eulogies. Watch for patterns, wait for that half-second delay, that shadow voice beneath the living words. And I think about what I'll say at my own funeral someday. What words I'll whisper half a second after someone speaks them for me. What corrections I'll make to the story people tell when I'm the one in the casket. Because I know now that we don't just lie silent. We participate. We speak. We correct the record. We make sure someone, somewhere, captures our real voice, even if only one person can hear it. Plot 1891 appeared on my screen during a routine database audit, and something about it made me pause. I'm Marion, records clerk at Elmwood Cemetery, and I've been maintaining burial records here for 12 years. I know every plot, every section, every quirk in our century-old filing system. I've digitized decades of paper records, cross-referenced handwritten ledgers with modern databases, and resolved countless discrepancies between what was documented and what actually exists in the ground. But I'd never seen a plot purchased 7 times. The audit was supposed to be simple. We were verifying that all occupied plots matched current ownership records, making sure nothing had slipped through the cracks during the digitization process. Most plots had one entry: purchased once, occupied once, maintained by designated family, normal. Plot 1891 had 7 purchase dates spanning from 1923 to present day. I pulled the full record. The first purchase was June 1923. A man named Harold Vance, age 47, died of influenza. His family bought plot 1891, buried him there, paid for perpetual care. Standard documentation, nothing unusual. Except in March 1924, there was a note: remains missing, plot found disturbed, family notified. No explanation, no follow-up, just that single line in the ledger, written in careful handwriting that predated my birth by decades. The plot was sold again in April 1924. Different family. A woman named Catherine Moore, age 33, died in childbirth. She was buried in plot 1891, which the records now listed as previously occupied, remains removed. That should have been the end of it. But in September 1926, another note: remains missing, plot empty, investigation inconclusive. Catherine Moore's body had disappeared from a sealed vault. The cemetery had investigated, found no evidence of grave robbing or disturbance. No explanation for how a body could vanish from locked concrete. The plot sat empty for 2 years before being sold again. 7 times. 7 different individuals purchased and buried in plot 1891. 7 times. The remains disappeared within 1 to 3 years of burial. Each time, the cemetery investigated. Each time, they found nothing. Just empty vaults and sealed earth with no signs of disturbance. The most recent purchase was 3 weeks ago. Thomas Brennan, age 68, died of cancer. His wife had chosen plot 1891 because it was available and in a nice section near the old oak trees. I'd processed the paperwork myself. I checked our current plot status. Plot 1891. Occupied Thomas Brennan. Interred September 28th. I should have stopped there. Should have flagged the historical discrepancy, made a note for my supervisor, moved on with the audit. But something about those 7 missing bodies bothered me. 7 people who'd been buried and then vanished without explanation across 100 years. I went to the physical archives in our basement, found the original ledgers from 1923. The handwriting was faded, but legible. Each disappearance was documented in the same careful script, as if whoever kept these records was deeply troubled by what they were recording, but determined to maintain professional accuracy. Next to Harold Vance's entry, in the margin, someone had written in pencil, "Plot refuses occupant." Next to Catherine Moore's entry, "Recommend closing plot to new sales." But the plot had never been closed. It kept being sold, kept being used, kept having the same problem. Why would a cemetery continue selling a plot that had this kind of history? I brought my findings to Mr. Henderson, our cemetery director. He's been here for 30 years, longer than anyone except the groundskeeper. If anyone would know about plot 1891's history, it would be him. He looked at my report in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "You found this during the audit?" "Yes. 7 burials, 7 disappearances. Why is this plot still in use?" "Because we can't prove anything's wrong with it," he said carefully. "No evidence of crime, no physical disturbance. The bodies simply aren't there when we check. Could be old records errors, could be misidentified plots, could be a dozen things." 7 times? He closed the report. "Marion, sometimes old cemeteries have quirks. Plot 1891 has a documented history of recording errors. We note it, we track it, but we don't close plots based on century-old administrative mistakes. Thomas Brennan was buried there 3 weeks ago. I'm aware. His burial went smoothly. No problems. Should we check the vault?" Henderson looked at me sharply. "Why would we do that?" "Because every other person buried there disappeared within 3 years. Most within 1 year. If the pattern continues, there is no pattern," Henderson said firmly. "There are historical inconsistencies in our records. That's all. We're not disturbing a fresh grave based on century-old clerical errors." But his voice lacked conviction. I could see it in his eyes. He knew about plot 1891, had known for years, and he was choosing not to act. I went back to my office and pulled Thomas Brennan's file. Read through the burial documentation. Everything was standard. His wife, Patricia Brennan, had been the primary contact. I had her phone number on file. I called her that evening after work, introduced myself, said I was following up on burial records, asked if she'd visited the grave recently. "I go every few days," she said. "Why? Is something wrong?" "No, just confirming details. Has everything seemed normal?" A pause. "What do you mean?" "The gravesite. The marker. Everything in order?" "Yes." "Why are you asking me this?" I didn't know how to explain. "Mrs. Brennan, has anyone from the cemetery contacted you about plot 1891? Should they have?" No, I'm just updating records. Thank you for your time." I hung up, feeling like a coward. What was I supposed to tell her? That her husband was buried in a plot with a century-long history of missing bodies? That 7 people before him had vanished from that exact location? 3 days later, Henderson called me into his office first thing in the morning. His face was pale. "Marion, I need you to pull up plot 1891's current status." I opened my database. Occupied. Thomas Brennan. Interred 3 weeks ago. Pull up the groundskeeper's report from this morning. He handed me a printed sheet. Morning rounds, routine checks, section 14. And there highlighted, Plot 1891 vault appears disturbed. Lock broken. Recommend immediate inspection. My hands started shaking. When? Jim found it at 6 a.m. We haven't opened the vault yet. I need you to be there. I need a witness for the records. We drove to section 14 in Henderson's cart. The groundskeeper, Jim, was standing near Plot 1891 with 2 police officers. The vault's access cover was already lifted, lying on the grass beside the opening. We haven't gone in, Jim said. Waited for you. Henderson climbed down into the vault access. I followed, my heart pounding. The vault seal was intact, no signs of tampering. Henderson attached the chain lift and opened the vault lid. Empty. No casket. No remains. No evidence that Thomas Brennan had ever been buried there 3 weeks ago. Just empty concrete and bare earth at the bottom. This isn't possible, Henderson whispered. One of the police officers called down. Everything okay? Henderson didn't respond. He was staring at the empty vault, his face ashen. I took photographs with my phone documentation. Evidence, proof that this was real and not some records error. We sealed the vault and went back to Henderson's office. He sat at his desk in silence for a long time. Finally, he opened a locked drawer and pulled out a folder. Old, worn, labeled, simply 1891. I've known about this plot for 15 years, he said quietly. My predecessor told me about it when I took over as director, made me promise to keep selling it. Said we couldn't close it without cause, that it would raise questions we couldn't answer. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of every report, every investigation, every missing person case associated with Plot 1891. 7 families who'd buried loved ones and then lost them to something inexplicable. The theory, Henderson continued, is that there's something wrong with the ground. Subsidence, maybe, or an underground cavity that the vaults drop into. But we've surveyed it 3 times. The ground is solid. There's no cavity, no explanation. Then why does this keep happening? I don't know. He looked at me with exhausted eyes. But now, I have to call Patricia Brennan and tell her we've lost her husband's body. And I have to do it without explaining that this has happened 6 times before in the exact same spot. We called the police, filed reports, opened an investigation into possible grave desecration, though everyone involved knew we wouldn't find answers. The vault had been sealed. The lock was intact. No signs of entry or disturbance. Thomas Brennan's body had simply ceased to exist. Patricia Brennan took it better than I expected. She was shocked, devastated, confused, but she didn't scream or blame us. She just asked quietly if we thought he was at peace. I didn't know how to answer that. Plot 1891 sits empty now. Henderson finally had it closed, marked in our system as not available for sale. It took losing Thomas Brennan to override 100 years of administrative inertia. But I still check that plot in our database. Every morning, first thing, I pull up the record and verify its status. Empty. Closed. No current occupant. Because I found something in the old ledgers that I didn't tell Henderson about. A note, dated 1923, written by someone who'd been here when this all started. Plot 1891 originally held the remains of unknown male, circa 1873. Remains removed during cemetery reorganization, 1891. Current location of remains unknown. Plot dedicated for new use. They'd moved someone. A century and a half ago, they'd moved an unknown person from Plot 1891 to make room for new burials. Moved them somewhere else in the cemetery. Somewhere unrecorded. Somewhere forgotten. And I think that person wants their plot back. Every few years, they take what we've put there. They reclaim their space. They remind us that some ground belongs to the dead who were there first, and we can't simply reorganize them away. I don't know where the 7 missing people are. I don't know if Thomas Brennan is with them wherever they've gone. I just know that Plot 1891 is empty again. And I wonder how long it will stay that way before someone forgets the history and sells it one more time. The safety bell started ringing at 3 a.m. during the worst thunderstorm of the season. I'm Chen, funeral director at Hilltop Memorial Gardens, and I've been running this cemetery for 19 years. We maintain about 3,000 graves spanning back to 1857, including a section of historical burials with 19th century safety equipment. Back when people feared being buried alive, some families installed bells above graves, a string running from the casket through a pipe to a bell mounted on a post. If the deceased woke underground, they could ring for help. They're relics now, tourist curiosities, historical oddities from an era of primitive medical knowledge and justified paranoia. I give tours sometimes, show people the 3 remaining safety bells in our historical section, explain how they worked. I tell people no one was ever saved by these bells, that they represent an irrational fear, that modern medical standards make them completely obsolete. I believe that until the bell in Section C started ringing. The storm had been building all evening. Heavy rain, lightning, thunder that shook the windows of the caretaker's cottage where I live on the cemetery grounds. I'd been asleep maybe 2 hours when the phone rang. Security system calling motion detected in Section C. I checked the cameras on my tablet, expecting to see a fallen branch or storm debris. Instead, I saw the bell moving. Section C has 1 remaining safety bell installation over the grave of Sarah Whitmore, died 1889, age 27. The bell sits atop a copper post about 6 feet high, with the pull string mechanism visible through a glass panel at the post's base. It's been there for over 100 years, unmaintained, corroded, purely decorative, and it was ringing, not from wind, not from storm vibration. The bell was swinging with deliberate force, the clapper striking with audible rings that carried across the cemetery even through the thunder. I could see it clearly on the security camera, consistent movement, regular rhythm, as if someone was pulling the string with intention. I put on my rain gear and drove the cart to Section C. The storm was vicious horizontal rain, lightning every few seconds, mud forming rivers between the graves. By the time I reached Sarah Whitmore's grave, I was soaked. Despite the rain gear, the bell was still ringing. I stood there, in the storm, staring up at it. The mechanism should be frozen, corroded beyond function. The string running down into the ground should have rotted decades ago. But the bell swung with clear, deliberate motion, the sound cutting through the storm like a scream. I approached the copper post and looked through the glass panel at the string mechanism. The rope was taut, running down through the post into the ground, pulled tight, and as I watched, it moved, not swaying from wind, but shifting with rhythmic pulls, like someone below was yanking it, like someone underground was ringing for help. I backed away from the post, my heart hammering. This wasn't possible. Sarah Whitmore had been dead for over 100 years. There was no one alive in that grave. The mechanism shouldn't work. The string should be long rotted. Everything about this was impossible. The bell kept ringing. I called my assistant director, Marcus, and our head groundskeeper, Tom. Told them to get to Section C immediately. Tom arrived first, running through the rain with a flashlight, and stopped dead when he heard the bell. "Is that what I think it is?" he shouted over the thunder. "The safety bell. It's been ringing for 20 minutes. Marcus arrived moments later. The 3 of us stood there in the storm, watching an antique bell ring from a grave that was over 100 years old. "Wind?" Marcus suggested, but his voice had no conviction. I shook my head and pointed at the string through the glass panel. "Look." They looked, saw the taut rope moving with deliberate pulls. "We need to excavate," Tom said. "If the mechanism's malfunctioning, if the string's caught on something, at 3 a.m. in a thunderstorm?" Marcus said. "We can't leave it like this. What if someone sees it? What if—" Tom stopped, not finishing the thought. "What if someone's alive down there?" None of us wanted to say it, but we were all thinking it. We made the decision to excavate immediately. Got the equipment from the maintenance shed, set up work lights around the grave. The storm continued, rain turning the work area into a mud pit. But we didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The bell kept ringing, and some primitive part of my brain insisted we needed to answer it. The excavation took 2 hours. Careful work, even in the storm, because we didn't know what we'd find. Tom operated the small excavator, removing earth in controlled scoops. Marcus and I worked with shovels, clearing around the vault access. The bell rang the entire time. At 5 a.m., we reached the burial vault. 19th century construction, brick-lined, sealed with mortar. No signs of disturbance. No cracks. No settling. No evidence that this grave had been opened since Sarah Whitmore's burial in 1889. We cleared the access point and broke the vault seal. I climbed down into the excavation with a flashlight, my clothes plastered with mud and rain. Marcus and Tom watched from above, their faces illuminated by work lights. The coffin was intact, wooden, heavily deteriorated, but structurally sound. And running from the coffin lid through a copper pipe toward the surface was the bell string, still intact after over 100 years. Impossible, but there it was. The string was pulled taut, stretched to its limit, as if whoever was inside had pulled with all their strength and was still pulling. "Chen?" Marcus called down. "What do you see?" "The coffin sealed, strings connected. No damage." "Then what's pulling the string?" I didn't answer. I placed my hand on the coffin lid, feeling century-old wood smooth beneath my palm. The string ran through a small hole drilled in the lid, just large enough for the rope. Standard safety bell installation. I should have opened the coffin, should have confirmed there were only bones inside, that the string was moving from some mechanical glitch, that everything had a rational explanation. But I couldn't. Some instinct told me that opening this coffin would be a violation worse than leaving the question unanswered. Instead, I followed the string upward through the pipe, examining the mechanism. The rope was worn smooth where it passed through the pipe's lower opening, as if it had been pulled repeatedly for extended periods. The wear pattern wasn't from age or rot. It was from friction, from use, from someone pulling desperately, hour after hour, trying to signal for help that never came. I climbed out of the excavation, told Marcus and Tom what I'd found. Tom's face went pale. "The string's been used?" "The wear pattern suggests repeated pulling, extended periods of pressure." "But that would mean..." The bell stopped ringing. We all looked up at the post. The bell hung silent, still, no longer moving despite the wind and rain. The sudden silence was more disturbing than the ringing had been. I climbed down into the excavation again, shone my flashlight on the string. It was slack now, no longer taut, as if whoever had been pulling it had finally let go. We sealed the vault without opening the coffin. Filled in the excavation as dawn broke, the storm finally diminishing to light rain. By 7 a.m., Sarah Whitmore's grave looked undisturbed, just another historical plot in Section C. But the bell post remained, the string still running down through copper pipe to a coffin that should hold nothing but bones. I researched Sarah Whitmore's death that morning, going through archived newspaper records and death certificates. She died suddenly, apparent heart failure, according to the 1889 documentation, buried quickly, as was common then. The safety bell had been her family's addition, paid for after her death, installed before burial. A precaution against a fear that ran deep in that era, being declared dead while still alive. I found one newspaper mention of her death, a small paragraph. Miss Sarah Whitmore, age 27, was found deceased in her rooms Tuesday morning. Dr. Emmett confirmed heart failure. Miss Whitmore had complained of feeling faint Monday evening, but retired early and appeared to sleep peacefully. Family requests privacy. Appeared to sleep peacefully. That phrase stuck with me. What if she hadn't been dead when they found her? What if she'd been in some kind of coma? Some death-like state that 19th century medical knowledge couldn't distinguish from actual death. What if they buried her alive? The safety bell was meant to prevent that horror, But Sarah Whitmore's grave was isolated, on the edge of the cemetery, far from any buildings. If she'd woken underground, if she'd pulled that string, who would have heard? The bell might have rung for hours, days even, with no one close enough to notice. I stood in Section C that afternoon, looking at Sarah Whitmore's grave, and thought about time, how it accumulates, how events echo forward, how a moment of terror from 1889 could resonate through 130 years and manifest in a storm at 3 a.m. when conditions were just right. The bell hasn't rung since that night. I check it every morning, watch the security footage, listen for any sound from Section C. Nothing. Just a silent bell and a corroded mechanism that shouldn't have worked but did. We replaced the vault seal with concrete this time, made sure nothing could disturb that grave again. I don't know if it matters. If Sarah Whitmore rang that bell during the storm, if she somehow reached across more than a century to signal for help, then sealing her grave more securely won't change anything. She already rang, and someone finally answered. Maybe that's all she needed. Not rescue that was impossible, just acknowledgement. Proof that her desperate pulls on that string hadn't been completely unheard. That someone, eventually, came to check. I think about her sometimes. Late at night when storms roll through, I wonder if she pulled that string for hours, for days, in the darkness of her coffin. Wonder if she died still gripping it, still believing someone would hear. And I wonder if that storm, that particular combination of lightning and rain and electromagnetic conditions, somehow created a moment where the past bled through, where her century-old terror found a voice again, just for those 2 hours, just long enough to ring the bell one final time. I had a plaque made for her grave, added to our historical marker, Sarah Whitmore, 1862 to 1889. The bell was heard. It seemed like the least I could do. For someone who rang for so long in the darkness, waiting for anyone to listen. The Mirror knew before I did. I'm Simmons, and I've been a prep tech at Westfield Mortuary for 11 years. The work is methodical, precise, and mostly silent. You learn to compartmentalize, to see bodies as vessels requiring care, rather than people who once laughed and dreamed. The embalming room became my second home, a place of stainless steel and chemical certainty where everything followed predictable patterns. The observation mirror hung on the north wall, installed decades before I started. It was positioned at an angle, so I could monitor my work without constantly turning my head, a practical tool that let me check positioning and presentation while keeping my hands free. The frame was old brass, tarnished at the edges, and the glass had that slight waviness you see in antique mirrors. I never thought much about it until the morning I prepared Mr. Vachon. He died of heart failure at 73. His face settled into that blank expression the recently deceased often wear. I'd just finished setting his features, using eye caps and mouth former to give him a peaceful appearance for the viewing. Standard procedure. I was mixing the arterial fluid when I glanced at the mirror, out of habit. In the reflection, Mr. Vachon's left hand had moved from his side to rest on his chest. I turned to the table. His hand was still at his side, exactly where I'd placed it. My pulse quickened, but I dismissed it as fatigue. I'd worked a double shift the day before. I positioned his hand on his chest, where I'd intended it to go anyway, the way the family had requested. When I looked back at the mirror, his hand was at his side again in the reflection, though on the actual table, it remained on his chest. The mirror was showing me where the hand had been, not where it was. A simple lag, maybe. A trick of the light catching the glass at an angle. But then I saw his jaw shift in the reflection, just slightly, as if he were about to speak. 3 seconds later, the actual jaw moved. I dropped my mixing spatula. The clatter echoed through the room, too loud in the chemical-scented quiet. I approached the table slowly, checking the mouth former. It had slipped, Just a fraction, but enough to let the jaw drop slightly open. A natural occurrence, I told myself. Body settle, muscles relax. This was normal, except the mirror had shown it to me first. Over the following weeks, I tried to ignore what I was seeing. Mrs. Delacroix's fingers curled in the reflection 2 seconds before they curled on the table. Mr. Huang's head turned slightly in the mirror before the actual movement, a gentle roll to the left that I had to correct. Each time, the mirror showed me what was coming. Like watching a preview of a film I was living, I stopped looking at the table directly. Instead, I watched the mirror, letting it guide my hands. When the reflection showed an arm beginning to drift, I'd secure it before the actual body moved. When I saw an eye cap starting to slip in the mirror, I'd fix it before the physical eye could sync. The mirror became my early warning system, and I became its student. The other techs noticed my strange habit of working while staring at the wall. "You okay, Simmons?" Marcus asked one afternoon. "You've been acting off." I couldn't explain. How do you tell someone that you've learned to trust a reflection more than reality? That you've started to understand the mirror isn't showing you the past or present, but something else entirely? Something that exists in the seconds between what is and what will be? The night I prepared the Hendricks child changed everything. She was 7 years old, hit by a car while riding her bicycle. Her parents wanted an open casket despite the trauma, so I worked carefully, respectfully, giving her the peaceful appearance every child deserves. I'd just finished styling her hair when I made the mistake of looking at the mirror first instead of the table. In the reflection, her eyes were open, not fully, just slitted, the way children sometimes sleep. But they were focused, looking at me. I felt my breath catch, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the table. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to confirm what I knew was coming. But I had to check the actual body, had to see if what the mirror promised would come true. I counted to 5, slowly, giving myself time to prepare. Then I turned. Her eyes were closed, positioned perfectly beneath the colored lenses I'd placed. I exhaled, relief flooding through me even as confusion remained. The mirror had been wrong. For the first time, it had shown me something that didn't happen, unless it was still coming. I worked quickly after that, finishing her makeup, positioning her hands around a small stuffed rabbit her parents had provided. I kept glancing at the mirror, watching her reflection, waiting for the eyes to open on the actual body. But they remained closed through the entire preparation, through the family viewing the next day, through the funeral service. The mirror had shown me something that never came to pass. Or maybe it had shown me something the girl had wanted to do but couldn't. A final attempt to wake up, to see, to know what was happening to her, occurring in some space between life and death that only the mirror could capture. I requested a transfer to Transport Services the following week. They asked why I was leaving a position I'd held for over a decade, and I told them I needed a change of pace. They didn't press further, but I still think about that mirror, about what it sees in the seconds before reality catches up, about all the small movements it showed me over the years, the settling and shifting that I'd learned to anticipate and prevent. Were those just natural post-mortem changes, or were they something else? Attempts at movement, at communication, happening in a frequency only the mirror could detect? I don't work in the prep room anymore, but sometimes I dream about it. In those dreams, I'm standing at the table with my back to the mirror, and I can feel it behind me, watching, showing my reflection things I can't see, showing me movements I haven't made yet, words I haven't spoken, a future that's always 2 seconds ahead of where I stand. And in those dreams, I'm always afraid to turn around and see what I'm about to do next. She walks backward into nothing. I'm Hector, and I've been the night watchman at Green Lawn Cemetery for 6 years. The job suits me. I prefer the quiet hours when the world sleeps, when the only sounds are whined through the oak trees and the occasional owl hunting mice between the headstones. I make my rounds with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, checking gates and locks, ensuring the dead rest undisturbed. The security system was installed 3 years ago after vandalism incidents. 12 cameras covering the main paths, gates, and high-traffic sections. I monitor them from a small office near the entrance, watching empty pathways and still monuments on grainy screens. Most nights, nothing happens. Most nights, I see only shadows and swaying branches. Then I notice the woman at grave H12. The first time, I thought I'd imagined it. A flicker of movement on camera 6, the one covering the east section. I rewound the footage and watched a woman in a dark dress kneel beside a grave for exactly 4 minutes. The timestamp read 2:33 a.m. I grabbed my flashlight and drove the golf cart to that section, but found nothing. No footprints in the dew-covered grass. No disturbance at all. I marked it as a glitch and forgot about it. But she appeared the next night. Same time, same place. Same dark dress that looked oddly formal, with a style I couldn't quite place. And the same ritual, kneeling for 4 minutes before standing and walking toward the gate. Except she walked backward, not stumbling or awkward, but smoothly, deliberately, as if moving backward was as natural as moving forward. She walked backward past monuments and trees, never looking behind her, never hesitating. And then, about 30 feet from the gate, she simply faded from the frame. Not walking out of camera range, but dissolving like smoke, her figure becoming transparent and then vanishing completely. I watched this happen 7 nights in a row before I checked the records for grave H12. The plot belonged to Eleanor Voss, buried in 1954, died at age 41. No surviving family listed. The burial was paid for by the county. A simple service with no attendees noted in the registry. A woman who died alone, forgotten by everyone, almost everyone. I started arriving at the east section before 2:33 a.m., positioning myself near H12 to see if I could witness this woman in person rather than on camera. But I never saw her during my physical rounds. Only the cameras captured her, only in that specific 4-minute window, only at that exact time. I dug deeper into the records, requesting archived newspaper articles from the 50s. It took 3 weeks of requests to the county library before I found what I was looking for. A small article from the Greenlawn Gazette, November 1952. Local girl vanishes during evening walk. Sarah Voss, age 16, disappeared while walking home from a friend's house. Last seen, wearing a dark dress, heading toward Maple Street, daughter of Eleanor Voss. No trace ever found. Investigation closed after 6 months due to lack of leads. Eleanor had buried her daughter's dress in an empty casket 2 months after the disappearance, according to a follow-up article. A funeral for a girl whose body was never recovered, whose fate remained unknown. Eleanor had died 2 years later, the obituary noting she never recovered from the loss of her only child. The woman on the camera was young, perhaps 16 or 17. Her dress was dark, formal, from an era decades past. I watched the footage more carefully after that, studying every detail I could make out through the grainy black and white feed. The way she knelt suggested reverence, not grief. The way she tilted her head as if listening for something. And the backward walk, always the same path, always ending in that gradual fade. She was visiting her mother's grave, had been visiting for 70 years, perhaps longer. A daughter who vanished, returning each night to kneel beside the woman who mourned her until death. But why walk backward? Why that specific gesture? I researched old superstitions, folklore about ghosts and visitation. In some traditions, spirits walk backward when leaving the living world, symbolizing their inability to move forward, their eternal looking back at what they lost. In others, it's a protective gesture, never turning your back on the dead you're leaving behind. Or maybe she was walking backward into the past, into 1952, into the moment before she vanished, replaying it every night. unable to move forward because she never had the chance to say goodbye. I started leaving things at the grave. Small tokens at first. Flowers, a smooth stone, a handwritten note saying, "Your mother never forgot you." They were always gone by morning, though nothing appeared disturbed. No footprints, no signs of removal, just absence where there had been presence. One night, I tried something different. I placed a photograph at the grave, an image I'd found in the archived newspaper articles. Eleanor Voss, standing beside a birthday cake, smiling at someone off camera. Sarah, probably, on her 16th birthday, months before she disappeared. That night, the woman on camera knelt for 6 minutes instead of 4. When she stood, she held something against her chest, clutching it with both hands. Then she walked backward as always, fading into nothing. But this time, she looked directly at camera 6, just before she vanished. I could see her face clearly for the first time. Young, peaceful, and smiling. She didn't appear the next night, or the night after that. I watched camera 6 at 2:33 a.m. for 3 weeks straight, but the woman never returned. The footage showed only empty grass and the silent grave marker of Eleanor Voss, who died alone but wasn't alone anymore. I still work the night shift at Greenlawn. I still make my rounds and watch the monitors, ensuring the dead rest peacefully. But I've learned something most people don't understand. The dead rest peacefully when their living business is finished. When the words are said, the goodbyes exchanged, the love acknowledged. Eleanor waited 70 years for her daughter to find her. Sarah searched for 70 years to say goodbye. And somehow, in the space between life and death, in the gray hours before dawn, they found each other again. Sometimes I visit H12 during my rounds. The grave looks ordinary now, just another weathered stone among thousands. But on certain nights, when the air is still and the moon is bright, I can almost hear it, the soft sound of footsteps walking backward through the grass, moving toward a reunion that finally came. The cameras don't capture her anymore, but I like to think she doesn't need to visit. She's already home. The sound was patient, like it had all the time in the world. I'm Paige, and I've been installing burial vaults for 9 years. It's physical work, precise and demanding, lowering concrete chambers into the earth and sealing them against time and elements. Most people don't know vaults exist, that caskets are placed inside these protective barriers before burial. It's my job to ensure they're positioned correctly, sealed properly, and secured against the shifting earth. Mrs. Drummond's vault was standard specification, a concrete chamber with a reinforced lid, installed in the Garden of Peace section where mature elm trees cast long shadows across manicured grass. The funeral had been small, attended by a handful of elderly friends. Mrs. Drummond had been 91, died peacefully in her sleep according to the service program. A good death, people said. A natural end. We lowered her casket at 2 in the afternoon. A bronze model with ivory interior, chosen by her estate lawyer, since she had no living family. I worked with my crew to position the vault lid, a 2,000-pound concrete slab that requires careful alignment. We used the crane to lower it into place, checking measurements twice before beginning the sealing process. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound from inside the vault, like fingernails on wood, slow and deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. I held up my hand, stopping the crane operator mid-seal. "You hear that?" Marcus, my supervisor, tilted his head. "Hear what?" "Listen." I knelt beside the vault, pressing my ear close to the seam where the lid met the base. There it was again, clearer now. Scratching. Consistent. Patient. Marcus waved dismissively. "Just settling. Happens all the time. The casket shifts when the vault is sealed. Wood expands and contracts. You've heard this before. Not like this." The sound had rhythm, intention. This sounds like Like you're tired, and it's been a long day. Marcus checked his watch. We've got 2 more installs before dark. Finish the seal. I wanted to argue, but Marcus had 20 years of experience to my 9. He'd heard every sound a vault could make, knew every trick concrete and wood could play. If he said it was settling, it was settling. We completed the seal, pumping concrete compound into the grooves until the lid was permanently fixed to the base. The scratching continued throughout the process. Soft, but persistent, like someone tapping out a code. By the time we finished and began filling the grave with earth, I couldn't hear it anymore. The sound was buried under 6 feet of soil and sod. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I researched Mrs. Drummond. The obituary was brief. Survived by no immediate family. Preceded in death by her husband in 1998 and her only daughter in 1973. She'd worked as a music teacher for 40 years, taught piano to generations of children. The photo showed a small woman with kind eyes and careful hands, the type who'd lived quietly and left gently. Nothing suggested anything unusual. Nothing explained the scratching. I tried to sleep, but kept hearing it in my memory. That patient, rhythmic sound. Too regular to be random, too purposeful to be structural settling. At 2 a.m., I gave up pretending I'd rest and drove back to Green Lawn Cemetery. The gates were locked, but I had a key from our contract work. The cemetery was different at night, shadows deeper between monuments, the silence heavier. I parked near the Garden of Peace and walked to Mrs. Drummond's grave. Fresh earth covered it, a temporary marker indicating where the permanent stone would go. I'd brought a stethoscope, the type doctors use, ordered online that evening and picked up from a 24-hour pharmacy. If there was still sound coming from the vault, I needed to hear it clearly. Needed to prove to myself that Marcus was right, that it was just settling, just concrete and wood playing tricks. I knelt on the fresh earth and pressed the stethoscope against the ground, closing my eyes to focus on the sound. For a long moment, I heard nothing but my own breathing and the distant hum of traffic beyond the cemetery walls. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. Humming, not scratching anymore. Humming. A tune. Tuneless and wandering, the sound of someone humming without awareness, the way you do when you're alone and lost in thought. It rose and fell in a slow tempo, patient and quiet, like a lullaby sung to an empty room. My hands shook as I pressed the stethoscope harder against the earth, trying to convince myself I was imagining this. But the humming continued, steady and calm, coming from 6 feet below where Mrs. Drummond's sealed vault held her casket. I pulled away from the stethoscope, and the humming stopped immediately. I pressed it back to the earth. The humming resumed, picking up exactly where it had left off, the same tuneless melody continuing without interruption. She knew I was listening. I yanked the stethoscope away and stood, backing away from the grave. The fresh earth looked undisturbed, peaceful in the moonlight. Nothing suggested anything unnatural. Just a grave like thousands of others, holding a woman who died peacefully at 91, but she was humming down there, humming in a sealed casket, inside a sealed vault under 6 feet of earth, humming a lullaby that had no beginning or end. I should have left then, should have driven away and never come back, but I needed to understand, needed to know what I was hearing. So I pressed the stethoscope to the earth one more time. The humming stopped. For 5 seconds, there was only silence. Then I heard something worse. Breathing. Deep, slow breaths, like someone sleeping peacefully. The gentle rhythm of rest. And beneath that, barely audible, a whisper. "Thank you for listening." I ran. Dropped the stethoscope and ran back to my truck, hands fumbling with keys, engine roaring to life. I didn't look back at the grave. Didn't let myself think about what I'd heard or what it meant. I just drove, putting distance between myself and that patient humming. I called in sick for the next 3 days. Marcus texted asking if I was okay, if something was wrong. I told him I had the flu, needed rest. On the 4th day, I returned to work but requested reassignment to a different section of the cemetery. Marcus approved without question. I drive past the Garden of Peace sometimes, see Mrs. Drummond's permanent marker installed. A simple granite stone with her name and dates. The grave looks settled now, grass growing green, indistinguishable from the hundreds surrounding it. But I wonder about the humming, whether it continues in the darkness of that sealed vault, a lullaby without end, sung by a woman who taught music for 40 years. Whether she's aware of where she is or lost in some dream of teaching, of playing piano for children who'll never grow old, whether she's waiting for someone else to press an ear to the earth and listen. I don't use stethoscopes anymore. Don't investigate sounds I can't explain. When Marcus says it's just settling, I nod and agree and seal the vaults without question. Because some sounds aren't meant to be heard, and some questions aren't meant to be answered. But late at night, when I'm trying to sleep, I sometimes hear it in my memory. That patient, tuneless humming. The sound of someone content in the darkness, singing to no one, waiting for nothing. The sound of settling that isn't settling at all. The ring shouldn't exist. I'm Saul, and I operate the cremation retort at Riverside Memorial. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest and necessary. I treat every set of remains with respect, following procedures that ensure families receive their loved ones' ashes without error. The retort is a chamber that reaches 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, reducing human remains to bone fragments that are then processed into the fine ash families recognize. It's science, controlled and predictable. The East Wing retort is the older of our two units, installed in 1997, but maintained to current standards. It runs on a programmed cycle: preheat, primary burn, secondary burn, cool down. 3 hours, start to finish. I've run thousands of cremations in my 12 years here, and the process never varies. Until it started running itself. The first time was a Tuesday morning at 4 a.m. The alarm system called me, indicating the East Wing retort had activated outside scheduled hours. I drove to the facility in my pajamas, assuming an electrical malfunction or programming error. When I arrived, the retort was running a full cycle, chamber glowing with heat, exhaust system engaged. There was nothing inside. I checked the log. No cremation scheduled, no remains loaded. The chamber was empty except for heat and flame, burning nothing, completing a cycle for no reason. I shut it down manually and called our maintenance contractor, who arrived at 7 a.m. to inspect the system. Everything checks out, he said after 2 hours of testing. No shorts, no programming errors. Maybe a power surge triggered the ignition sequence. I accepted that explanation because the alternative made no sense. Machines don't activate themselves. They respond to commands, human or programmed. But the East Wing retort had run a complete cycle, with no input, no reason, no purpose. It happened again Wednesday night. 4 a.m. exactly. Alarm waking me from deep sleep. Same situation. Retort running. Nothing inside. All systems functioning normally. This time I stayed and watched it complete the full cycle. 3 hours of burning nothing, while I sat in the observation room with coffee and confusion. Thursday night, I didn't wait for the alarm. I arrived at 3:45 a.m. and positioned myself in front of the East Wing controls. I wanted to see if it would activate, wanted to catch the moment of impossible ignition. At exactly 4 a.m., the system engaged. No button pressed, no command given. The preheat cycle began, temperature climbing, chamber glowing red through the observation window. I watched the empty interior burn for 3 hours, trying to understand what I was witnessing. When the cool-down cycle completed and the chamber was safe to open, I put on protective gear and inspected the interior. Standard protocol requires checking for any remaining fragments or foreign objects. The chamber was clean, swept by the previous cycle's heat, except for the ash pan. There's always residual ash, even after an empty burn. Dust, debris, microscopic particles. I removed the pan and was about to empty it into the disposal bin when something caught the light. A ring, small, delicate, gold with significant wear. I picked it up carefully, turning it in my gloved fingers. The inside band held an inscription, worn but readable, "Forever yours, M to J, June 1972. My hands started shaking. 6 months earlier, I'd cremated Mrs. Janet Holloway, age 74, died of cancer. Her wedding ring had been left on per family request, a gold band with an inscription. I remembered it specifically because the daughter had cried when showing it to me, explaining her father Marcus had died 2 years prior, and Janet wanted to be cremated, wearing his promise. I'd watched that ring go into the retort with Janet's remains, watched it melt in the heat, the gold liquefying and burning away with everything else. Wedding rings don't survive cremation. They're either removed beforehand or destroyed in the process. Nothing remains. But I was holding it. The same inscription, the same wear pattern, the same size. Impossible, but real. I checked our records, pulling up Janet Holloway's file. Ring description, gold band inscription, "Forever yours, M to J, June 1972. One photo attached, taken during intake documentation. I zoomed in on the image of her hand, the ring clearly visible. It matched perfectly, the worn spot on the band where decades of wear had thinned the gold, the slight bend from an old injury to her finger. Every detail identical. I sealed the ring in an evidence bag and locked it in my office safe. Then I went home and tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe we'd made an error 6 months ago, removed the ring before cremation and forgotten to document it. Maybe this was a different ring, coincidentally similar. Maybe I was losing my mind. Friday night, I returned at 3:45 a.m. If the retort activated again, I wanted to be there, wanted to see if anything else would appear. 4 a.m., like clockwork, the system engaged. I watched through the observation window as the empty chamber heated, flames licking at nothing, burning air and darkness for 3 hours. When the cycle completed, I opened the ash pan immediately. Another ring. This one was silver, whiter, with a different inscription. "All my love, R." I checked our records frantically, searching cremation logs for any silver rings in the past year. Found it in November. Robert Sinclair, aged 68, wedding band with inscription, "All my love," given to his wife Rachel, 50 years married. I'd cremated him with that ring on his finger, watched it melt away like all the others. But here it was, solid and real, sitting in the ash pan of an empty retort. I started pulling records going back months, cross-referencing every cremation where jewelry was left on the deceased. Found 7 cases where rings went into the retort and should have been destroyed. I laid out photos, comparing inscriptions, wear patterns, sizes. 3 rings now sat in my safe, and 4 more were missing. 4 more cremations where rings should have burned but might not have. I didn't return Saturday night. Didn't want to find another ring, another impossible object pulled from flames and heat. Instead, I researched cremation processes, looking for any scientific explanation for metal surviving temperatures that should liquefy it. Found nothing. Gold melts at 1,948 degrees. Silver at 1,763 degrees. The retort runs at 1,800 degrees. More than enough. But Sunday morning I received a call from our weekend operator. "Saul, you need to see this. The East Wing retort ran again last night. I found something in the ash pan." I drove to the facility with dread heavy in my chest. The operator handed me another evidence bag, this one containing 2 rings, 1 gold, 1 platinum, both with inscriptions, both from cremations I'd performed in the past 6 months. "There's more," the operator said. He led me to the East Wing retort and opened the observation window. Inside the chamber, arranged in a perfect circle on the floor, were 3 more rings. They hadn't been there during the burn, I knew that. They'd appeared after, materialized in the cooling chamber like offerings or messages. 7 rings total. 7 couples who'd been cremated with symbols of their love. Metal that should have burned away but somehow returned. 7 impossible objects that shouldn't exist. I collected all 7 rings and spread them out on my desk, studying them in the fluorescent light. Each one had been worn for decades, shaped by the lives of people who'd loved and been loved. Each one had entered the retort's flames and been destroyed, reduced to nothing by heat and time. And each one had come back. I started making calls to the families, asking careful questions about what they'd received after the cremations. Every family confirmed they'd gotten urns with ashes, weighed and processed according to standard procedures. No one mentioned missing rings. No one seemed aware anything was wrong, because nothing was wrong on their end. They had their loved ones' ashes, had scattered or stored them according to wishes. The rings weren't missing from their perspective. They'd accepted that the rings had burned, had made peace with that loss. But the rings had come back to me, to the place where they'd burned, the chamber where love had been reduced to ash and heat. They'd returned like salmon swimming upstream, pulled by something I couldn't understand. The East Wing retort hasn't activated itself since Sunday. I've been running scheduled cremations all week, and everything functions normally. But I keep the 7 rings in my office, sealed in evidence bags, documented with photos and notes. Physical proof of something impossible. I don't know what to do with them. Can't return them to families without admitting I don't understand what happened. Can't destroy them because they've already survived destruction once. Can't explain them because there is no explanation that makes sense. So I keep them locked away and wonder about the next activation, about what the retort might burn when there's nothing inside, about what other impossible things might appear in the ashpan, pulled from flames that should consume everything, about love that refuses to burn away, even when there's nothing left but ash and memory. The East Wing retort sits silent now, waiting. And I sit with 7 rings that shouldn't exist, counting the nights until 4 a.m., when machines remember things that humans have forgotten. The handwriting was immaculate, like something from another era. I'm Liv, and I've coordinated funerals at Thornton Memorial for 14 years. My job is ensuring every detail flows smoothly, greeting mourners, managing the condolence book, coordinating with clergy and musicians, making sure families can grieve without worrying about logistics. I've learned to read rooms, to sense when someone needs space or comfort, to navigate the complex emotions that surface when death brings people together. The condolence book sits on a pedestal near the entrance to our main chapel, a leather-bound register where attendees sign their names and write brief messages. Some write elaborate tributes, others just their signature. I review each book after services, noting attendance for family records and ensuring no pages are damaged or missing. Mr. Hawthorne's service was standard, attended by perhaps 40 people. Retired postal worker, died at 79, survived by 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. A life well lived, mourned appropriately. I'd watched people file past the book throughout the morning, most signing quickly before taking their seats. When I reviewed the register that evening, one entry stopped me cold. The signature was written in elaborate cursive, the kind taught in schools decades ago when penmanship was an art. Each letter was perfectly formed, slanted at a precise angle to the ink, a rich black that contrasted sharply with the modern ballpoint scrawls surrounding it. Margaret Ashford. It read, "See you soon, darling." I didn't recognize the name, and the message seemed oddly intimate for someone attending a service for Mr. Hawthorne. I checked the attendance list, compared signatures, asked the daughters if they knew a Margaret Ashford. No one did. No one remembered seeing anyone who matched that name. Yet there it was, written clearly between 2 entries I'd watched people sign. The handwriting belonged to someone who wasn't there, or at least wasn't noticed. Someone who left a message that felt less like condolence and more like promise. I photographed the page and filed it with the service records, making a note about the unknown attendee. It bothered me more than it should have. In 14 years, I'd never had someone sign the book without being seen, without being remembered by anyone present. Funerals are intimate gatherings where strangers stand out. Someone should have noticed Margaret Ashford. 2 weeks later, I coordinated a service for Miss Eleanor Pritchard, aged 89, died in her sleep at Sunview Assisted Living. She had no living relatives, no close friends. Her estate lawyer had arranged the service, a simple affair with a handful of facility staff attending out of respect. I'd never met Eleanor, knew nothing about her life beyond what the brief obituary mentioned. Retired schoolteacher, never married, lived quietly. The casket viewing was optional, but the lawyer had requested it be open for the brief service. Standard presentation. I ensured Eleanor looked peaceful in a lavender dress chosen from her personal belongings. Her hands were folded over a small bundle. The lawyer had provided personal items to be buried with her. As I made final adjustments before the service began, I noticed the bundle contained letters, old letters, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon. The top envelope had slipped loose, revealing an address and date, June 1949. I shouldn't have looked. It wasn't my place to read a deceased woman's private correspondence. But something made me carefully unfold the letter, just enough to see the first few lines. "My darling Eleanor," it began. "The summer seems longer without you here." The handwriting was immaculate cursive, perfectly slanted. Each letter an artwork. I'd seen that exact handwriting 2 weeks earlier in Mr. Hawthorne's condolence book. Same style, same precision, same era. I pulled out my phone and compared the photograph I'd taken to the letter in Eleanor's casket. They matched perfectly. The distinctive loop of the capital M, the elegant tail on the lowercase g, the precise spacing between words. Margaret Ashford's signature in the condolence book was written by the same hand that had penned this love letter 76 years ago. My pulse quickened as I carefully unfolded more of the letter, reading words written when Eleanor Pritchard was young, when someone named Margaret loved her enough to write poetry about summer and separation. "I count the days until fall term begins, and I can see you again." The letter continued, "My heart is yours entirely, now and always. See you soon, darling. With all my love, Margaret." "See you soon, darling." The exact phrase from the condolence book. Written in the same hand, separated by decades but identical in every way. I checked the other letters in the bundle, hands shaking slightly as I untied the ribbon. Dozens of letters, all from Margaret to Eleanor, spanning years. Letters about teaching positions and shared apartments, about quiet dinners and walks in the park. Letters that spoke of love in careful language, coded phrases that women of that era used when their relationships couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The last letter was dated December 1952. "They're transferring me to the Cincinnati school." It read, "I don't know when we'll see each other again, but I promise you, darling Eleanor, when the time comes, I'll be there. Wait for me." No more letters after that. Just silence spanning 73 years. I stood alone in the chapel with Eleanor's casket, holding letters from a woman who'd made a promise in 1952. A promise to be there when the time came, to wait for Eleanor when everything else had ended. Margaret had signed the condolence book 2 weeks before Eleanor died. "See you soon, darling." Not a memory, not a ghost, but a promise kept. An appearance at a stranger's funeral, leaving a message for someone who wasn't dead yet but would be soon. The service was brief, attended by 4 people who'd barely known Eleanor. I watched them sign the condolence book mechanically, duty more than grief. When they left, I checked the register. The last entry, below the nursing home director's signature, was written in perfect cursive. "Margaret Ashford. Finally, together, my love." I'd been standing at the entrance throughout the entire service. No one had approached the book after the director signed. Yet there it was, fresh ink, the same immaculate handwriting. I looked at Eleanor's casket, at the peaceful expression on her face, at the letters clutched in her hands. She'd waited 73 years, lived alone, Taught school and retired and aged in a room at Sunview. Waited for a promise made when they were young, when love had to be hidden, when separation meant decades of silence. And Margaret had come back, had signed the book at a stranger's funeral as practice or preparation, leaving a message that wouldn't make sense until 2 weeks later. Had returned to sign Eleanor's book, to confirm what Eleanor might have believed, but couldn't know for certain, that when the time came, Margaret would be there. I left the letters in Eleanor's hands and closed the casket myself, sealing her with the only proof that she'd been loved. The estate lawyer never asked about them, never questioned what was buried. No one would read those letters now, would know the story they told, except me, and whoever Margaret was. Whatever Margaret was, I keep the photographs of both condolence entries in a locked file in my desk. Physical evidence of something I can't explain, handwriting that connects 2 funerals and 7 decades of separation. I've stopped trying to understand it rationally, stopped looking for logical explanations, because some promises transcend death. Some love refuses to recognize the boundaries between living and gone. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before a service begins, when I'm alone in the chapel with flowers and silence, I wonder if Margaret is there too. Unseen, unnoticed, waiting for the next time she needs to sign a book, waiting to keep another promise, to be there for someone else who loved in secret and died alone, writing messages that won't make sense until the time comes, in handwriting that belongs to an era when love was poetry and promises were permanent. I don't fear it anymore, the idea of Margaret Ashford appearing in my condolence books. Instead, I find it comforting. The thought that somewhere, in whatever space exists beyond life, there's someone who remembers, someone who keeps promises made 70 years ago, who shows up even when no one else does, someone who writes, in perfect cursive, "See you soon, darling," and means it forever. I recognized the footsteps before I knew what I was hearing. I'm West, and I'm the overnight medical examiner at County General's morgue. It's solitary work, conducting autopsies when the hospital sleeps, writing reports for cases that can't wait for morning. I prefer the night shift's quiet, the absence of interruptions, the focus that comes with darkness and fluorescent lights. Most people find morgue work unsettling, but I've always felt comfortable among the dead. They don't complain, don't judge, don't interrupt. I've worked this shift for 3 years, always alone, except for the bodies waiting on gurneys and the hum of refrigeration units keeping remains preserved. The morgue occupies the hospital's basement level, accessible by service elevator or emergency stairs, isolated from patient floors. It's designed to be forgotten, a necessary space people avoid thinking about. But I'm never completely alone. The footsteps started 6 months into my tenure. I was finishing an autopsy on a traffic accident victim, documenting findings and preparing to close the incision. That's when I heard them in the hallway, outside footsteps approaching the morgue door. Distinctive footsteps. Step, drag, step, drag. The gait of someone with an old injury, favoring their right leg. I waited for a knock or the door to open. The footsteps stopped directly outside, interrupting the line of light beneath the door with a shadow. I counted to 10, expecting someone to enter. When nothing happened, I crossed the room and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating beige tiles and blank walls. No one there, no sound of retreating footsteps, just vacancy and the antiseptic smell of hospital cleaning solution. I returned to my work, dismissing it as auditory paresthesia or sounds from other floors traveling through ventilation shafts. Old buildings make noise, morgues especially, with their refrigeration units, cycling, and drainage systems gurgling. I'd imagined the human element, projected pattern, onto random sound. But the footsteps returned, always during overnight shifts, always approaching the door but never entering, always with that distinctive step-drag rhythm, like someone limping on an old injury that never quite healed. After the fourth occurrence, I asked about the history of the morgue during a daytime handoff with Dr. Chen, the day shift examiner. Has anyone ever mentioned hearing footsteps down here at night? Chen looked at me with something like sympathy. Your hearing, Lorne? Dr. Alexander Lorne, she explained, had been the overnight medical examiner for 23 years before dying of a massive heart attack at his desk in this very morgue. 5 years ago, during a routine shift, he'd collapsed while writing a report. By the time the day staff arrived, he'd been dead for hours. He had an old injury, Chen said, shattered his right ankle in a car accident as a young doctor, limped for the rest of his life. That step drag pattern was distinctive. Everyone who worked with him recognized it. I felt cold despite the morgue's regulated temperature. The footsteps I'd been hearing matched perfectly the same rhythm, the same cadence, the gait of someone with an old ankle injury walking the hallways they'd walked for over 2 decades. Does it bother you? Chen asked. We can request maintenance, check the ventilation if you want. Might be sounds from other floors. I told her no. It was fine. I'd just been curious. But I wasn't fine. I was hearing a dead man's footsteps approaching my door every night, stopping but never entering. A presence that seemed to be checking on the space he'd occupied for half his life. I started researching Dr. Lorne, found his obituary. Respected pathologist, contributed to numerous criminal cases, known for meticulous attention to detail. Survived by a wife and 2 adult children. The article mentioned his dedication, often working past scheduled hours, double-checking findings, ensuring no detail was missed. His former colleagues remembered him fondly. Lorne never cut corners. One said, if he had doubt about a finding, he'd re-examine everything. Saved careers, maybe even lives, catching things others missed. A perfectionist, I realized. Someone who'd taken pride in thoroughness, who died at his desk mid-report, working even in his final moments. 3 months after learning about Dr. Lorne, I was conducting an autopsy on a 63-year-old male suspected heart attack. The deceased had been found unconscious at home, pronounced dead at the hospital. Initial examination suggested cardiac arrest, consistent with his medical history of hypertension and high cholesterol. I was documenting the chest cavity examination when I heard the footsteps. Step, drag, approaching down the hallway, clear and distinct. They stopped outside the door, as always, shadow interrupting the light beneath it. But this time, something slid under the door. A piece of paper, yellow with age, appearing in the gap between door and floor like a message passed in secret. I stared at it for several seconds before crossing the room and picking it up. The handwriting was neat, precise, slightly old-fashioned in its formality. Just 5 words. Check the left lung again. My hands trembled as I held the paper. No one had entered the morgue. The door was locked from inside, accessible only with keycard. The hallway had been empty every time I'd checked before. Yet here was a physical note, written in steady handwriting, giving me specific instruction. I returned to the examination table and looked at the deceased's left lung, which I'd already examined and documented. Initial observation showed typical cardiac-related congestion. Nothing unusual, nothing that required re-examination. But the note said to check again. I retrieved a fresh scalpel and made additional incisions, sectioning the lung more carefully than protocol required. Examined tissue in better light, looking for something I might have missed. Found nothing initially, just the expected changes from prolonged cardiac distress. Then I saw it. A small mass, barely 3 millimeters, hidden deep in the lower lobe. A tumor, malignant from initial observation, that had eroded into a pulmonary vessel. The erosion had caused a bleed, small but significant, not enough to show externally, but enough to trigger cardiac arrest in a man with pre-existing heart disease. The cause of death wasn't simple cardiac arrest. It was complicated by undiagnosed lung cancer that had eroded a blood vessel, creating conditions that triggered the heart attack. This changed everything. Changed the death certificate. changed whether this was natural death or death hastened by undiagnosed disease, changed what the family would know about his final months, what might have been caught with proper screening. I documented the finding meticulously, taking photographs and tissue samples, writing a report that Dr. Lorne would have approved of. When I finished, I looked at the note again, that careful handwriting on yellowed paper. I checked hospital records later, searching archived files for Dr. Lorne's old reports, found his handwriting in documents dating back decades. It matched perfectly. The precise letters, the formal style, the neat arrangement of words. The note had been written by a man who'd been dead for 5 years, warning me to look more carefully. I placed the note in a folder in my desk drawer, physical evidence of something that shouldn't exist. Over the following months, I heard the footsteps regularly, always during complex cases, always when there was risk of missing something important. I learned to listen for them. When I heard that step drag pattern approaching, I knew to pause, to reconsider my findings, to examine with the same meticulous attention Dr. Lorne had been known for. Sometimes I found nothing new. Sometimes I caught details that would have been missed. Otherwise, a subtle fracture, an unexpected toxin, evidence that changed understanding of how someone died. The notes appeared occasionally, always slipped under the door during those visits. Brief messages in that careful handwriting. Recheck the liver. Sample the stomach contents. Look at the neck again. I followed every instruction, not because I feared Dr. Lorne's ghost, but because I came to understand what was happening. He died here, at this desk, in the middle of work he'd dedicated his life to. Some part of him remained, drawn to the space he'd occupied, still checking findings, still ensuring nothing was missed, still doing the work he'd loved, helping a successor he'd never met in life. I don't tell colleagues about the footsteps or the notes. How do you explain that your predecessor reviews your work from beyond death? That sometimes the best quality control comes from someone who cares enough to return during night shifts and make sure the job is done right? But I keep every note in that folder, filed chronologically, proof of something I can't explain but have learned to trust. When I hear those footsteps approaching now, I feel grateful rather than frightened. Dr. Lorne spent 23 years ensuring nothing was missed. Death hasn't changed his commitment. Last week, I finished a particularly complex case involving suspected poisoning. I was confident in my findings, ready to complete the report and send the body for final disposition. Then I heard them step, drag, step, drag. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I waited, but no note appeared. After several minutes, the footsteps retreated down the hallway, that distinctive gait fading into silence. I understood. Dr. Lorne had checked my work and found nothing to correct. I'd been thorough enough, careful enough, met the standard he'd spent a lifetime establishing. It felt like approval from a mentor I'd never met, validation from someone who understood the weight of getting it right. I still work the night shift at County General's morgue, conducting autopsies while the hospital sleeps. I'm still alone here, technically, just me and the dead and the hum of refrigeration units. But I'm not really alone. Somewhere in these hallways, on nights when cases are complex and details matter, Dr. Lorne still makes his rounds, still checks on the work, still ensures nothing slips past that should be caught, still teaching me, 5 years after death, what it means to be thorough. The footsteps are coming now as I write this, that familiar step drag pattern approaching down the hallway. I'm finishing a report on a drowning case, documenting findings that seem straightforward. But I've learned to wait when I hear Dr. Lorne coming, to pause and consider what I might have missed, to check again